Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in slowly, questions stretch out comfortably, and science takes the long, winding road toward rest. Tonight, we're easing into a thought that's a little strange, a little ancient, and surprisingly gentle when you give it time to unfold. It's not a question about what will happen next, but about what might have happened long before memory, long before writing, and long before the familiar shape of the world settled into place. Before we get there, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Maybe you're listening from a bedroom with the lights dimmed, or from a quiet living room, or through headphones while the rest of the world has already begun to soften into night. What time is it where you are? Not the precise number on a clock, just the feeling of it. Late enough that the day is loosening its grip. Early enough that the night still feels open. If you find this space calming, if the slow drift of ideas helps your thoughts settle rather than race, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner of science reach others who might be looking for the same gentle pause. And now, without any hurry at all, let's begin easing into tonight's idea. Imagine a world without edges, not in the sense of cliffs or shorelines, but in the deeper sense of separation. No Atlantic to cross, no Pacific to circumnavigate, no distant continents whose names would one day sound exotic or unreachable. Imagine waking up on a planet where every piece of land touched another piece of land, where the ground beneath your feet was part of a single continuous surface that wrapped around the globe like a vast uneven blanket. This was Pangea, a time when Earth gathered its continents into one enormous whole, long before the shapes we recognize today had pulled apart and wandered to their current positions. It existed hundreds of millions of years ago, a supercontinent so vast that its interior stretched far from any ocean breeze, and its coastlines traced the outlines of a world still deciding what it would become. Now imagine something even more unusual layered gently on top of that ancient geography. Imagine that somewhere on this unified landmass, humanity, or something very much like humanity, found its footing earlier than we ever expected. Not just scattered groups of foragers moving quietly across open plains, but a true civilization, one that built, shared, remembered, and adapted while the Earth itself was still whole. This is not a claim about lost history or hidden ruins waiting to be uncovered by satellites. It's a careful, imaginative question. What if the conditions of a single, connected world had allowed Earth's first civilization to emerge far earlier than we think? And if it had, what kind of civilization would that have been? When we picture early human societies, we often picture separation, river valleys cut off by deserts, coastal cultures bounded by seas, mountain ranges that slow movement and fracture language. Distance shapes difference. It always has. But Pangea offers a very different starting point. A world where walking, over generations, could carry you astonishing distances without ever stepping onto a boat. In such a world, isolation would be harder to come by. Ideas would not have to leap oceans to spread. They would simply move, gradually, carried by people, by families, by long journeys that never truly left land behind. Knowledge would drift outward like ripples instead of remaining trapped in one basin or another. Think about how much of early civilization depends on connection. Agriculture spreads when seeds travel. Tools improve when designs are shared. Language grows richer when ideas collide and merge. On a single continent, these processes might accelerate not because people were smarter or more ambitious, but because the planet itself made sharing easier. The land would still be immense, of course. Pangea was not a small place. It contained deserts larger than anything we know today, forests that stretched beyond the horizon, mountain chains still rising from tectonic restlessness. But the absence of oceans as barriers changes the story in subtle ways. Rivers would still divide regions, climates would still vary, but nothing would be truly unreachable in the long arc of time. In the quiet beginning of such a civilization, there would be no sense of a world map, No knowledge that the land eventually curved back on itself. Just directions, toward warmer regions, toward cooler ones, toward fertile floodplains and away from dry interiors. People would move as people always have, guided by water, soil, animals and seasons. Over time, paths would become familiar. Camps would become settlements. Settlements would begin to recognize one another not as strangers, but as neighbors whose neighbors stretched endlessly outward. Trade might begin simply, not with coins or ledgers, but with shared tools, shared techniques, shared stories exchanged around fires that looked up at the same stars from different latitudes. One of the most interesting consequences of such a world would be how slowly difference might emerge. In our own history, oceans helped languages fracture. Beliefs diverged when groups became isolated for long enough that their stories bent in different directions. On Pangea, those fractures would take much longer. Accents might shift, customs might vary, but complete separation would be rare. This could mean that Earth's first civilization, if it arose on a single landmass, might feel less like many cultures and more like one culture expressed in countless local ways, a shared foundation with regional flavours rather than sharply divided traditions, not uniform but connected in a way that feels unfamiliar to us now. Climate would play a quiet but powerful role in shaping such a society. Pangea's interior was likely harsh, dry, and extreme, with temperature swings far beyond what coastal regions experience today. Life would cluster toward rivers and edges, places where water softened the land's severity. These habitable corridors would become the arteries of civilization, long stretches of livable space linking distant regions together. In these corridors, knowledge would accumulate slowly, techniques for growing food in challenging soil, methods for storing water, ways to build shelter against heat and cold. None of this would appear suddenly. It would emerge through repetition, failure, and careful observation of patterns in the land. Without oceans to interrupt them, seasonal rhythms might feel more unified. Monsoons, droughts, migrations of animals, all could echo across enormous distances. A dry season in one region might hint at conditions unfolding thousands of kilometers away. People would learn to read these patterns not as local quirks, but as expressions of a vast shared system. Over generations, memory would stretch far back. Stories would not just explain how to hunt or plant, but why the land behaved the way it did, why rivers swelled when they did, why certain winds carried storms. In a connected world, these explanations would travel widely, becoming part of a shared understanding of Earth itself. It's worth pausing here to notice how different this feels from the way we usually imagine the distant past. We often think in fragments, a cradle of civilization here, another one there, separate origins, separate timelines, but a unified land invites a unified beginning, not because everything was the same, but because nothing was truly cut off. As time passed, tools would improve. Stone would give way to refined stone. Then perhaps early metals discovered independently in multiple places, but quickly shared along those long terrestrial routes. Fire, already mastered, would be controlled more precisely. Cooking, heating, shaping materials, all would benefit from knowledge that spread without needing ships or sails. The idea of ownership might also develop differently. In a world without hard borders, land might be understood less as something fenced and more as something used, returned to, and respected within a broader network. Movement would remain normal, even expected. Settlements might grow, but the concept of being permanently rooted to one small region could feel unnecessary. This doesn't mean conflict would be absent. Disagreements over resources, territory, or beliefs are not inventions of modernity. But the scale and nature of those conflicts might differ. When everyone ultimately shares the same landmass, the idea of absolute separation becomes harder to sustain. Cooperation would often be the easier path, not because people were more peaceful, but because connection made hostility costly. As centuries passed, the civilization might begin to sense the slow, almost imperceptible changes beneath their feet. Rivers altering their courses, coastlines shifting, earthquakes reshaping familiar landscapes. They would not know about tectonic plates, but they would know that the land was not static, that the ground itself participated in time. What they would not know, at least not yet, is that the world they inhabited was already preparing to change in a much larger way. The continents were never meant to remain together forever. Deep beneath the surface, forces were already at work, pulling, stretching, thinning the crust. These movements unfolded far too slowly to notice within a single lifetime, or even many lifetimes. But over vast spans of time, they would redraw the map of existence. For a civilization living on Pangea, the early stages of this separation would feel subtle. A widening rift here, increased volcanic activity there, shallow seas beginning to form in low-lying regions. These changes would not signal an ending but a transition, one that unfolded so slowly it felt like continuity. People would adapt as they always do, shifting settlements, following resources, adjusting stories to fit a land that no longer behaved exactly as it once had. The idea of separation would enter thought gradually, first as inconvenience, then as distance, and eventually as absence. And here, quietly, without drama, the story begins to change. Because once water began to divide land in earnest, once the slow rise of oceans turned corridors into barriers, the unified civilization would begin to fracture. Not all at once, not catastrophically, but steadily. Groups that once exchanged ideas easily would find journeys growing longer, more dangerous, eventually impossible. Languages would begin to drift more noticeably. Beliefs would diverge without constant reinforcement. Technologies would advance along different paths. What was once a single cultural current would become many streams, each flowing according to local needs and conditions. From the inside, this would not feel like loss. It would feel like normal life continuing under new circumstances. People rarely notice the moment when a shared world becomes several smaller ones. They only notice later, when distance has had time to work. If this ancient civilization truly existed, its memory would not survive as a single clear record. It would scatter. Pieces would remain embedded in later cultures, shared myths that echo similar themes across continents, genetic patterns that hint at ancient movement, tools and techniques that appear independently but feel oddly familiar. Time, water, and geology would erase the rest. Cities would sink, erode, or be buried beneath younger layers of earth. Coastlines would retreat and advance. What once lay inland might now rest beneath oceans. And so, when we look at the world today, with its separated continents and isolated histories, we might be seeing the aftermath of a story that began when Earth was still whole. Not a lost golden age, not an advanced forgotten empire, but a simple, early attempt at civilization shaped by a planet that had not yet learned how to let go of itself. As this idea settles in, there's no need to decide whether it's true or not. The value here isn't improving anything. It's in noticing how deeply Earth's shape influences the paths life can take, how geography guides culture, how connection and separation are written into the ground long before they appear in human stories. When you picture the Earth in your mind, it's almost impossible not to see it the way we've always known it. Blue oceans breaking up green and brown land, familiar outlines that look right even when they're slightly wrong. Continents separated by vast distances of water, each one feeling like its own stage where history unfolds independently. That image is so deeply learned that it takes a bit of effort to loosen it. So take that effort slowly. Instead of starting with coastlines, start with ground. Continuous ground. No sudden drop into water after a few hundred kilometers. No sense that land eventually gives way to something else. Just earth, stretching on, changing texture and colour, rising into mountains, flattening into plains, drying into deserts, softening into forests, but never truly stopping. This is what a single Earth would have felt like. Not a globe divided into named pieces, but one immense surface that curved gently beneath the sky. If you were standing somewhere near what we would now call the centre of Pangea, there would be no smell of salt in the air, no gulls overhead, no tides marking time. The ocean would exist, yes, but it would feel distant, almost abstract, something spoken about rather than seen. Water would arrive by river or rain, not by horizon-filling waves. For people living there, the idea that land could end abruptly might feel strange, even unsettling. Movement across this world would not involve crossings, it would involve journeys, long ones, taken in stages passed down through generations. A route would not be a line on a map, but a sequence of remembered places. A bend in a river where the water tasted different. A stretch of stone where tools dulled faster. A valley where winds behaved oddly and fires needed tending. Over time, these journeys would knit the land together culturally, not because anyone set out to unify it, but because contact would be normal. People would meet others who spoke differently, lived differently, ate different foods, but who were not unreachable. There would always be another path forward. On a single Earth, direction would matter more than distance. North, south, toward colder ground or warmer ground, toward rain or away from it. Migration would be guided by climate gradients rather than by barriers. If conditions worsened in one region, moving did not require reinventing transportation. It required patience. This kind of world would shape how people thought about space itself. Today we think in terms of here and there, near and far, across and beyond. But on a unified landmass, the dominant distinction might be familiar and unfamiliar, rather than separated and isolated. The unknown would still exist, but it would feel approachable, something that could eventually be walked into, not something that required crossing an empty expanse. Even the sky might feel different above such a world. Without the moderating influence of nearby oceans, the interior of Pangea likely experienced more extreme temperatures, hotter summers, colder winters, sharper transitions between seasons. Clouds would behave differently. Storms would gather with less predictability. Droughts could linger longer. Rain might arrive suddenly and violently. People living there would learn to read subtle signs, the colour of the horizon at certain times of year, the way animals shifted their routes, the timing of certain plants flowering slightly earlier or later than expected. Survival would depend on attention, not just to the land beneath one's feet, but to the land hundreds of kilometres away, because what happened there would eventually ripple outward. A single Earth would also blur the idea of the edge. Today, coastlines act as natural punctuation marks. They tell us where land ends and something else begins. On Pangea, the edges would be fewer and farther between. The land would feel dominant, almost overwhelming in its scale. Oceans would exist more as boundaries enclosing the land rather than features slicing through it. This could influence how early people conceptualized the world. Instead of thinking of themselves as inhabitants of islands or regions bordered by water, they might think of themselves as living on Earth itself, full stop. The planet would not feel fragmented. It would feel like one continuous home with many rooms. Imagine stories told in such a world, not tales of crossing seas to reach distant lands, but tales of long walks, of generations moving in one direction and never reaching the end. Myths might speak of places so far away that no one had ever returned from them, not because they were unreachable, but because the journey itself became a lifetime. Trade in this environment would be slow but steady. Goods would change hands many times before reaching distant regions. A tool made in one place might pass through dozens of communities, each one modifying it slightly, improving it, adapting it to local needs. By the time it reached its farthest destination, it would be both familiar and transformed. This gradual diffusion would smooth sharp differences. Innovations would not explode outward suddenly. They would seep. Farming techniques, building methods, Ways of storing food or managing water would move along human networks like warmth through stone, slowly but persistently. The lack of oceans as barriers would also mean fewer abrupt cultural breaks. Instead of civilizations rising in isolation and then encountering one another suddenly, contact would be ongoing, incremental, almost unremarkable. Differences would exist, but they would feel like variations rather than oppositions. This doesn't mean the world would feel small, quite the opposite. The sheer scale of Pangea would be humbling. Walking for weeks without reaching a fundamental boundary would reinforce the sense that Earth was vast beyond comprehension. People might develop a deeper patience with distance, an acceptance that some places simply took a long time to reach. Time itself might be perceived differently. When travel takes generations, planning stretches far beyond individual lives. Decisions are made with an understanding that outcomes may not be seen by those who begin them. This could foster a long-view mindset, where continuity matters more than speed. Even conflict would take on a different character. Without oceans to define clear separations, disputes would be local rather than absolute. There would be fewer places to retreat to where contact was impossible. Resolution, whether peaceful or forceful, would be necessary because neighbours were not easily avoided. At the same time, the vastness of the land would prevent total control. No single group could realistically dominate an entire supercontinent. Power would diffuse naturally, balanced by distance and the limits of communication. Influence would travel, but slowly, attenuated by geography. One of the most profound differences, though, would be psychological. Living on a single Earth might foster a stronger sense of belonging to the planet as a whole. Not in an abstract philosophical way, but in a practical one. The land would feel continuous, interconnected, shared by all living things. Animals, too, would move across enormous ranges. Migration routes could span what are now separate continents. Species that are currently isolated might once have interacted regularly. Humans observing these movements would learn patterns on a planetary scale, recognizing that life itself flowed freely across the land. This would influence early knowledge systems. Instead of developing highly localized explanations for natural phenomena, people might notice broader consistencies, similar stars rising in similar patterns across distant regions, comparable animal behaviors repeating thousands of kilometers apart, a sense that the world operated under shared rules. Navigation would rely heavily on landmarks and celestial cues. Without coastlines as reference points, orientation would depend on mountains, rivers, prevailing winds, and the sky. Over time, this could lead to sophisticated understanding of astronomy, not as an abstract science, but as a practical guide for movement and survival. Night skies over Pangea's interior would be darker than most skies today. Far from ocean-reflected light and free from artificial illumination, stars would dominate. The Milky Way would be a bright, textured band overhead. For people living there, the sky might feel closer, more involved in daily life. Seasonal travel might become ritualized. Certain routes taken only at certain times of year, certain gatherings occurring when environmental conditions aligned. Culture would sync with planetary rhythms, not because of ideology, but because ignoring them carried consequences. As settlements grew more permanent, they would still remain connected by these long threads of movement. A city, if it formed, would not be an endpoint. It would be a node, a place where paths intersected, knowledge accumulated and then dispersed again. And all the while, beneath this slow, steady human activity, the Earth itself would be changing, imperceptibly at first. A widening crack here, a shallow basin forming there, water beginning to linger in places where it once drained away. People would adapt, as always, without fully understanding the scale of what was unfolding. A new lake would be seen as a feature, not a warning. A flooded lowland would prompt relocation, not existential concern. Change would feel local, manageable, even familiar. The idea that the land itself could split, that the world could one day be divided by vast oceans, would not yet exist. it would be beyond imagination. After all, if you've never seen land end, why would you expect it to? This is the quiet power of imagining a single Earth. It invites us to step into a mindset shaped not by separation, but by continuity. To consider how deeply geography shapes thought, culture, and expectation. And to recognise that the way we understand the world today is not inevitable, but contingent on how the planet happened to arrange itself beneath us. As this picture settles, it doesn't need to resolve into anything definitive. It's simply a place to stand for a while, a world where all lands touched, where movement was possible in any direction, and where the idea of distance meant patience rather than division. Long before anyone thought to draw a line on a surface and call it a boundary, long before symbols were pressed into clay or scratched into stone to preserve a moment, there was a stretch of time so quiet that it left almost no trace of itself. Not silent in the sense of lacking sound, because wind still moved, water still flowed, animals still called to one another, but silent in the sense that nothing was yet recording itself. No names, no dates, no sense that what was happening needed to be remembered later. This is the kind of time that rarely gets attention, because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't begin with an event or end with a collapse. It simply exists, wide and open, carrying life forward without commentary. And if a first civilization truly took shape on a single, connected Earth, this deep silence would have been its cradle. Before maps, space is not abstract. It is felt. Distance is measured in tired legs, sore feet, and the number of nights spent sleeping under unfamiliar skies. Direction is not a coordinate, but a habit. You walk toward where the sun warms the land earlier. You avoid stretches where water becomes scarce. You remember routes not because they are drawn, but because your body learned them. In such a time, there is no overhead view of the world, no sense of scale beyond what one can traverse in a lifetime. The idea that the land might curve back on itself, that walking long enough in one direction could eventually bring you home from the other side, would not exist. The world would feel endless, not infinite, but unconcerned with being fully known. Memory too would function differently. Without writing, without durable markers, memory would live in repetition. What is done often enough becomes stable. What is not repeated fades quietly. Knowledge survives not because it is archived, but because it remains useful. A path remembered because it leads to water. A story remembered because it explains a danger. A technique remembered because it prevents hunger. The earliest generations of a civilization would not think of themselves as founders. They would simply be people doing what worked, refining habits over time. The concept of beginning only appears much later, when someone looks back and decides that a particular moment mattered more than the ones before it. In this deep early time, days would not be counted. They would be experienced. Morning would arrive with light, not with obligation. Night would come with darkness, not with schedules. Sleep would follow fatigue rather than a clock. Waking would follow rest rather than an alarm. The absence of formal timekeeping does not mean chaos. In many ways, it creates a steadier rhythm. Life aligns with environmental cycles. Hunger follows effort. Rest follows exertion. Work expands and contracts with seasons rather than hours. The body becomes the calendar. Without maps, the land would not be divided into regions with names. Places would be known relationally. The valley beyond the hills, the river after the long plain, the rocky ground where walking hurts. Names, when they appear, would likely describe function or experience rather than ownership. This kind of spatial understanding fosters intimacy with the environment. When the land is not abstracted, it becomes personal. You don't live in a territory. You live among features that behave in predictable ways. You learn where frost lingers longest, where animals pass through regularly, where soil stays damp even when rain is scarce. In a unified landmass like Pangea, this knowledge would accumulate across enormous distances. Not quickly, not completely, but persistently. As groups moved, they carried their understanding with them, not as a grand theory of the world, but as a set of expectations that could be tested and adjusted. Before memory was externalized, forgetting was not failure, it was selection. Details that no longer mattered slipped away. Patterns that remained relevant endured. This creates a kind of collective intelligence shaped by usefulness rather than completeness. Imagine how stories would function in such a context. They would not exist to entertain in the modern sense. They would exist to compress experience, to make lessons portable. A story about a foolish traveller who ignored signs of weather change is easier to remember than a list of observations about cloud behaviour. These stories would shift slightly with each telling, not because accuracy was unimportant, but because flexibility kept them alive. A story that adapts survives, one that freezes becomes brittle and breaks. Without written records, identity would be fluid. You would know who you were through relationships rather than documents. Through who recognized you, who trusted you, who remembered your actions. Reputation would be memory in motion, maintained by consistency rather than proof. In such a world, the idea of history as a sequence of events would not yet exist. There would be no sense of linear progress, no feeling that time was marching towards something. Life would feel cyclical, shaped by repetition rather than accumulation. Seasons would matter more than years. Births and deaths would be noticed, mourned, celebrated, but not tallied. Generations would blend into one another. Elders would carry memory not because they were old, but because they had seen patterns repeat enough times to recognize them. This deep silence of early time would also mean that mistakes could vanish without echo. A failed experiment, a settlement abandoned, a route that proved dangerous. Without records, these missteps would leave only faint traces. The land would reclaim them quickly, but successes would leave marks. Paths would become worn. Campsites would reappear. Preferred gathering places would gain meaning. Over time, these repeated choices would begin to structure space itself, shaping where people tended to be, even without deliberate planning. The absence of maps does not prevent orientation. It simply shifts it inward. People would navigate using layered cues, the angle of the sun, the feel of the ground, the smell of vegetation, the soundscape at different times of day. This kind of navigation is slow to learn but hard to forget. Children would absorb it through exposure, not instruction. Walking alongside adults, watching which routes were chosen and which avoided, learning the land as a lived environment rather than an object to be measured. Before memory became external, the present would dominate experience. Planning would exist, but only within visible horizons. You plan for winter because you have seen winter before. You prepare for drought because you remember thirst. Long-term abstraction would be rare, not because people were incapable, but because there was little incentive. In a world where all land is connected, the unknown would still exist, but it would feel continuous rather than separate. There would always be more land beyond the known, but it would feel like an extension rather than a different realm. This continuity would shape how people understood other groups. Strangers would be unfamiliar, not alien. Differences would be noted, but they would exist on a spectrum rather than as absolutes. Over time, repeated contact would blur sharp distinctions. Without borders, movement would not require permission. You go where conditions allow, where relationships exist, where survival makes sense. Authority, if it appears, would be local and situational, based on trust rather than territory. The deep silence of early time would also mean that catastrophe, if it occurred, would not be preserved as a singular moment. Floods, droughts, volcanic events would be folded into story rather than recorded as data. Their memory would fade unless they repeated often enough to matter. This doesn't make early life fragile. It makes it resilient in a different way. When nothing is fixed, adaptation becomes normal. You don't rebuild exactly what was lost. You adjust. The land itself would be an active participant in shaping memory. Areas that remained stable would accumulate meaning. Places that changed rapidly would resist attachment. Over time, this would subtly guide where longer-term settlements emerged. If an early civilization arose here, it would not announce itself with monuments. It would emerge quietly as a density of habit. More people staying in one place longer, more shared practices, more continuity between generations. The idea of civilization would not be visible from within. There would be no comparison point, no awareness that something unprecedented was happening. It would simply feel like life becoming more patterned, and all of this would unfold beneath a sky that never changed its fundamental appearance. Stars would rise and set with reassuring consistency. The moon would cycle with predictable patience. These rhythms would anchor experience far more than any calendar. Without written memory, the past would not accumulate as weight. It would exist as atmosphere, felt rather than referenced. The future would feel open, not because it was imagined, but because it was not constrained by recorded precedent. In this deep early time, humanity would not yet be separate from its environment in thought. People would not think of themselves as living on the land. They would think of themselves as within it, part of its ongoing behaviour. Only later, much later, would distance, separation and documentation begin to change that relationship. Only when land began to pull apart and memory found a way to anchor itself outside the body would the silence begin to break. For now, though, it remains quiet. A long stretch of lived time without commentary. A world moving forward without needing to explain itself. And it is from within this quiet, patient backdrop that more complex patterns will eventually emerge, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, as continuity gives rise to structure and repetition begins to resemble intention. There is something quietly powerful about the idea of a world where movement does not require invention. No boats carved from trunks, no sails stitched against uncertainty, no calculations about currents or storms, just walking. Step after step, carried forward by muscle, patience, and familiarity with the ground beneath you. In a single, continuous landmass, the horizon is not a boundary. It is an invitation. In such a world, the limits of a civilization are not defined by water or by walls, but by endurance, knowledge, and time. If Earth's first civilization emerged on Pangea, it would have been shaped by the simple fact that, given enough generations, every direction was open. Not easily, not quickly, but undeniably open. Walking changes how distance is understood. When movement happens at human speed, landscapes are not crossed, they are absorbed. You do not pass through a region in a day and forget it. You spend weeks learning how the ground behaves. You learn where shade appears at certain hours, where water collects after rain, where animals tend to pause. Travel becomes education rather than transit. A civilization that could walk to every horizon would not think in terms of expansion the way later societies did. There would be no moment of setting out to conquer or discover. Movement would be gradual, organic, driven by necessity rather than ambition. Families drifting outward from familiar areas, groups branching off when land could support them, paths forming not because they were planned, but because they worked. Over time, these paths would connect vast distances, not as roads in the modern sense, but as remembered sequences, one valley leading to another, a chain of water sources across dry ground, a line of landmarks passed down through shared experience. The world would become legible through use. Because everyone moved this way, movement itself would not be exceptional. Travellers would not be rare figures. They would be expected. People arriving from far away would carry different habits, different tools, slightly different ways of speaking, but they would not feel foreign in the way ocean crossers once did. They would feel like variations of the same story. This has profound implications for how culture develops. When contact is continuous rather than episodic, change happens slowly and evenly. Innovations spread like warmth rather than sparks. A new method of shaping stone would appear here, then there, then everywhere in between, gradually blending into local practice. The same would be true for social structures. Ideas about leadership, cooperation, and responsibility would not be imposed suddenly. They would evolve through repetition and comparison. Groups encountering one another would notice what worked and what didn't. Practices that led to stability would persist. Those that caused friction would be modified or abandoned. In a world where walking connects everything, isolation becomes temporary rather than permanent. Even groups that settle far from dense population centres would know, at least in theory, that others exist beyond the horizon. This awareness alone changes behaviour. It discourages extreme divergence. It encourages compatibility. Conflict, when it arises, would also be shaped by this openness. There would be fewer final solutions. Driving another group away would not erase them. They would simply relocate, perhaps only a short distance. Retaliation would remain possible. This would favour negotiation, alliance, and shared norms over absolute domination. The scale of Pangea reinforces this dynamic. Although the land was continuous, it was enormous. Walking to every horizon did not mean that everyone knew everyone else. It meant that no region was fundamentally unreachable. Distance still existed, but it was measured in effort rather than in possibility. This would give rise to layered familiarity. You know your immediate surroundings intimately. You recognise neighbouring groups. You have heard stories about distant ones. Beyond that lies the unknown, but it is an unknown that feels connected, not sealed off. Over generations, this connectivity would allow a civilization to develop a shared foundation without becoming uniform. Local adaptations would flourish. Diets would vary. Housing styles would respond to climate. Rituals would align with regional conditions. Yet beneath this variation, certain assumptions would remain consistent. For example, the idea that land is traversable, that movement is normal, that knowledge can arrive from afar, that strangers are potential allies rather than permanent outsiders. These assumptions would be baked into the culture at a deep level. Children growing up in such a society would expect change. They would know that people come and go, that new tools appear, that stories evolve. Stability would not mean stasis. It would mean continuity through adaptation. Trade in this context would not revolve around rare luxury goods crossing impossible barriers. It would revolve around specialization. Certain regions would excel at particular crafts due to local materials. Stone here, clay there, fibers somewhere else. These products would move outward gradually, exchanged along chains of contact. No single trade route would dominate. Instead, a mesh of connections would form, flexible and resilient. If one path became difficult, others would compensate. This redundancy would protect the civilization from collapse due to localized disruption. Walking also shapes time horizons. When journeys take weeks or months, planning becomes patient. Decisions are made with an understanding of delay. Urgency gives way to persistence. This fosters a different relationship with progress. Improvements are valued, but they are not expected to transform life overnight. Technological development in such a society would likely be steady rather than explosive. Without sudden influxes of radically new ideas from isolated cultures, innovation would build incrementally. Each improvement would be tested across many environments, refined through use. This does not mean stagnation. It means robustness. Technologies that survive would do so because they worked under varied conditions. Tools would become versatile rather than specialized. Knowledge would emphasize adaptability. The built environment would reflect this mindset. Settlements would grow where conditions allowed, but they would remain permeable. There would be fewer rigid boundaries between living spaces and travel corridors. The idea of a city as a sealed entity would be unlikely to emerge early. Instead, habitation might appear as gradients. dense centres where resources concentrate, fading outward into less permanent dwellings. Movement through these spaces would be constant. The line between resident and traveller would blur. Even identity would be influenced. A person might be known not just by where they live, but by where they have been. Experience would carry social weight. Those who travelled widely would be valued not for conquest, but for perspective. They would bring news, techniques, and insights gathered over long distances. In this sense, walking becomes a form of communication. Information does not leap across space. It is carried slowly by people. This ensures that knowledge arrives with context. Ideas are not stripped of their origins. They are accompanied by explanation and adaptation. A civilization built on walking would also develop a deep respect for the land's limits. You cannot ignore terrain when your body must navigate it. Steep ground demands caution. Arid stretches demand preparation. Floodplains demand timing. The land teaches restraint. This restraint would influence settlement patterns. Overuse of a region would be immediately felt. Depleted resources would require movement rather than import. This naturally limits population density and encourages balance. Over time, certain regions would become hubs, not because they were centrally planned, but because geography favoured them. Crossroads of rivers, mild climates, fertile soil. These places would attract people, ideas and activity, becoming anchors in the network. Yet even these hubs would remain connected by walking paths rather than cut off by moats or walls. Defence, if needed, would rely more on social cohesion than physical barriers. A networked society defends itself through mutual dependence. The notion of walking to every horizon also shapes imagination. When land extends endlessly, curiosity becomes grounded. You wonder what lies beyond the next ridge, not beyond the world. Exploration is incremental. Discovery is continuous. There would be no dramatic moment of realizing the Earth is large. That realization would be lived daily. Each journey reinforces it. Each generation pushes knowledge slightly further. At the same time, there would be no awareness of the planet as a globe. The idea of every horizon would not imply completeness. It would imply openness. There is always another horizon no matter how far you go. This mindset carries humility. You are part of something vast but not unknowable. The world reveals itself slowly, at walking speed. Understanding is earned through presence. As the civilization grows older, its collective memory would include stories of long journeys, not heroic epics of conquest, but practical accounts of endurance. How people adapted to new conditions, how alliances formed across distance, how mistakes were corrected. These stories would serve as guidance rather than glorification. They would emphasize learning over triumph, survival over dominance. All of this unfolds quietly, without the sharp edges we associate with the later historical eras. No sudden rise, no golden age proclaimed. Just a steady weaving of human life across a single shared land. And while people walk, the earth beneath them continues its own slow movement. Unnoticed shifts, gradual stretching, subtle changes in elevation and drainage. None of this would interrupt daily life in any dramatic way. Yet these geological motions are laying the groundwork for future separation, for a time when walking will no longer suffice, when horizons will become edges, when paths will end in water. But for now, in this long middle stretch of early civilization, movement remains simple. Feet on ground, horizon after horizon. A world connected not by technology, but by patience. From this foundation, everything else follows. Knowledge, culture, adaptation, all shaped by the assumption that the world is continuous and that, given enough time, you can reach whatever lies ahead. When land stretches unbroken in every direction, the sky becomes the one feature that truly belongs to everyone. No matter how far people walk, no matter how different the ground beneath their feet becomes, the sky remains familiar. It arches overhead with the same patterns, the same cycles, the same slow reliability. On a single Earth, long before borders or calendars, this shared sky would quietly knit human experience together. Day after day, the sun would rise and fall in predictable arcs, its angle shifting slowly over the year. People would not describe this in terms of latitude or axial tilt. They would feel it in their bodies, in the length of shadows, in how quickly the ground warmed, in the way certain tasks became easier or harder depending on the time of year. The sky would not be an object of study at first, it would be a guide. When seasons change on a connected landmass, they do not do so abruptly everywhere at once. They travel. Heat moves gradually. Rain belts shift slowly. Cold creeps rather than arrives. This means that people living across Pangea would experience seasonal patterns that were related, even if not identical. A dry period in one region might precede a similar change farther along a migration route. A cooling trend noticed by one group could become a warning carried to another. This creates a subtle form of shared knowledge, not centralized, not formally agreed upon, but accumulated through repeated observation and movement. Someone who travelled regularly would notice that certain signs repeated themselves over long distances. The same stars rising at similar times, the same winds shifting in predictable ways, the same animals beginning their movements as conditions changed. Over time, these observations would turn into expectations. Expectations would turn into habits. Habits would turn into stories. Stories are one of the first ways humans compress complexity. When the world is too large to fully understand, stories make it manageable. They carry patterns in memorable forms. On a single Earth, stories about the sky and the seasons would spread widely, because they would remain relevant across enormous distances. A story explaining why rains come when they do would make sense in many regions, even if details differed. A tale about a star that appears before the cold season would be useful anywhere that star could be seen. These stories would adapt slightly as they travelled, but their core would remain recognisable. This shared narrative layer would not require agreement. People would not need to decide on a single version. The overlap would happen naturally, because the sky itself provided consistent reference points. You could walk for months and still see the same constellations, just rising at different angles, appearing at different times of night. In such a world, the sky becomes a kind of universal language, not spoken, but observed. It allows people separated by great distances to share expectations without ever meeting. When one group notices that a particular pattern in the clouds precedes heavy rain, that knowledge can travel with them and prove true elsewhere. Seasons would also structure social life. Without artificial light or climate control, daily and yearly rhythms would matter deeply. Work would cluster around daylight. Certain activities would only make sense during particular times of year. Movement would often follow seasonal windows when conditions were safest. This creates shared pauses. Across a continent, many groups might slow down during the harshest times, whether heat or cold. These pauses allow for reflection, teaching, and storytelling. When movement slows, memory deepens. In these moments, stories are not entertainment, they are reinforcement. They remind people why certain choices are made, why routes are followed, why some times are for gathering and others for dispersing. Because land is continuous, these stories would not remain isolated. As people move, they carry stories with them. They share them at camps, at temporary gatherings, during exchanges. Over generations, stories spread not as fixed texts, but as flexible frameworks. This flexibility is important. It allows stories to remain relevant as conditions change. A story about the sky does not need to be precise. It needs to be suggestive. It needs to point attention in the right direction. Watch for this sign. Prepare for that change. Shared skies also mean shared uncertainty. When weather shifts unexpectedly, it affects many regions. A prolonged dry period might strain communities across vast areas. This creates a sense of collective challenge. even without direct communication. People would notice that hardship is rarely isolated, that when conditions worsen in one place, they often worsen elsewhere. This reinforces the idea that the world is interconnected, that local experience is part of something larger. In response, cooperation becomes valuable, not because of abstract ideals, but because shared vulnerability demands it. Groups that exchange information about conditions increase their chances of survival. Those that hoard knowledge place themselves at risk. Over time, this dynamic encourages openness. Knowledge becomes something to share rather than protect. A story that helps another group prepare for winter does not diminish the teller's survival. It enhances it, because those people may one day return the favour. The sky also shapes timekeeping long before clocks. People mark time by cycles they can see, phases of the moon, the position of certain stars at dusk or dawn, the lengthening and shortening of days. These markers would be understood broadly across Pangea. Even if names differ, the phenomena are the same. A full moon is visible everywhere at once. A solstice affects the entire planet, even if its impact feels different depending on location. This shared temporal framework allows for coordination without formal agreement. Gatherings can be planned around celestial events. Movements can be timed to seasonal shifts. Expectations align naturally. As these patterns repeat, they become embedded in culture. Songs, rituals, simple practices repeated year after year. These do not require centralized authority. They persist because they align with reality. Children growing up in such a world would learn the sky early, not through instruction, but through exposure. They would notice which stars elders point out, which phases of the moon bring changes in activity, which times of year feel safe or dangerous. This knowledge becomes intuitive. You don't need to explain why something happens, you just know when it does. Shared skies also mean shared awe. Standing under a vast night sky far from artificial light has a profound effect. It places individual concerns in a larger context. It reminds people that they are part of something immense. This sense of scale can shape values. When the sky feels dominant, human conflicts feel smaller, not unimportant but contextualized. There is less incentive to imagine oneself as the center of everything. This does not eliminate ambition or competition, but it tempers them. It encourages continuity over disruption. In a connected world, these shared experiences accumulate into a kind of quiet unity. Not a political unity, not a declared identity, but a baseline similarity in how people understand their place in the world. Stories about the sky would eventually branch into stories about origins, why the sun behaves as it does, why certain stars matter. These stories would differ in detail, but they would often point in similar directions. The land beneath may vary wildly, but the sky above remains consistent. This consistency allows for shared meaning even as cultures diverge. As generations pass, this shared sky becomes a reference point for memory. When people think about the past, they anchor it to seasons and celestial events. The year when the rains failed, the winter when the cold lingered too long, the summer marked by a strange star or an unusual eclipse. These memories do not need dates. They are remembered relationally. Before that drought, after that flood, during the long cold. This way of remembering creates continuity without precision. It allows the past to remain accessible without being fixed. As long as the land remains connected, these shared patterns continue. Even as the Earth begins its slow process of change, the sky remains stable on human timescales. The stars do not rearrange themselves. The sun does not alter its path abruptly. This stability gives people a sense of reliability in a world that otherwise changes gradually. Rivers shift, forests move, animals migrate, but the sky persists. And so, when subtle changes begin to appear in the land, they are interpreted against this stable backdrop. A new body of water forming, a lowland becoming marshy. These are seen as local adjustments, not signs of planetary transformation. The stories adapt. They always do. New elements are added, old ones fade, but the structure remains. Shared skies make shared seasons possible. Shared seasons make shared stories meaningful, and shared stories create a sense of continuity that does not depend on written memory or centralized authority. All of this unfolds quietly, without ceremony. No one declares that a civilization has formed. No one names an era. Life simply becomes more patterned, more predictable, more interconnected. And while people look up at the same stars night after night, unaware of the deeper movements beneath their feet, the Earth continues its own slow work. Tension builds, plates shift, water prepares to intrude where land once dominated. But for now, the sky still belongs to everyone. The seasons still travel across a unified land. Stories still carry meaning from one horizon to the next. And within this shared framework, human life continues to weave itself into the rhythms of a world that feels whole, stable, and endlessly open. Water does something subtle to the way people think about land. It moves through it, reshapes it, connects places that would otherwise feel separate. On a single, continuous Earth, rivers would not be lines on a map or borders to negotiate. They would be living features, familiar companions that guided movement, supported life, and quietly linked distant regions without asking permission. In a world before maps, a river is not an obstacle first. It is a promise. Where water flows reliably, life gathers. Plants cluster along its banks. Animals return to it again and again. People follow, settle nearby, learn its moods. Over time, a river becomes a reference point, not because it divides land, but because it organizes it. Rivers on Pangea would stretch far beyond what we now consider natural boundaries. Without seas to interrupt them, drainage systems could span enormous distances, winding through multiple climates before finally reaching the ocean. A person living far inland might never see the sea, but they would still live by water that eventually found its way there. This creates a sense of connection that doesn't rely on awareness. People along the same river system would be indirectly linked. What happened upstream would eventually affect those downstream. Floods, droughts, sediment, even pollutants introduced unknowingly would travel. Over time, communities would learn this relationship, not as a scientific principle, but as lived experience. A group living downstream might notice changes in water quality or flow, and associate them with events far away. A forest cleared upriver might lead to increased flooding seasons later. A shift in animal populations upstream could ripple outward. These observations would not be framed as environmental management, but they would shape behaviour. Because rivers are continuous, they resist ownership in the early sense. You can live beside a river, you can depend on it. But claiming it entirely would feel impractical. It flows beyond you. It existed before you arrived and will continue after you leave. This fosters a different relationship with resources. Instead of rigid control, there is accommodation. You adjust to the river rather than forcing it to conform. You learn when it floods. You build slightly higher. You move when necessary. Rivers would also act as natural travel corridors. Walking along a river is easier than crossing unknown terrain. Water provides orientation, sustenance, and predictability. Over time, footpaths would naturally align with waterways, creating long, gentle routes that stitch the land together. Along these routes, information would travel, not quickly, but steadily. News carried by people moving for trade, marriage, seasonal work, or necessity. Over generations, these river paths would become arteries of civilization, not because they were planned, but because they worked. Unlike later eras where rivers often became political borders, in this early time they would do the opposite. They would blur distinctions. Communities along the same river would share certain practices simply because their environment demanded it. Fishing techniques, flood management, seasonal timing, all would align. Even language might be influenced. Words describing water behavior would be shared and adapted. Metaphors would emerge from common experience. A phrase used to describe patience might reference a slow-moving current. A warning might echo the sudden rise of water after distant rains. Mountains too would shape life, but in a different way. Before maps and names, mountains are not defined by elevation or coordinates. They are defined by effort, by how hard they are to cross, by how weather behaves around them, by how they interrupt or redirect movement. In a unified landmass, mountain ranges could stretch for thousands of kilometers, forming long spines across the continent. They would not divide the world into separate realms so much as slow interaction between regions. Crossing mountains takes time, preparation and knowledge, but it remains possible. This difference matters. A mountain range that slows but does not isolate encourages adaptation rather than divergence. Groups on either side would develop distinct traits, but contact would never fully cease. Over long periods, paths would be found, passes discovered, routes refined. Without names, mountains would be known relationally. The high ground where the air thins, the cold peaks where snow lingers, the long climb that exhausts travellers. These descriptions would be practical rather than symbolic. Naming comes later, when places need to be fixed in memory beyond immediate use. Before that, function dominates. A mountain is where weather changes quickly. A mountain is where certain animals live. A mountain is where you take a different path. This practical understanding creates a deep familiarity with terrain. People would not think of mountains as abstract obstacles. They would think of them as environments with rules that must be respected. Certain times of year are safer. Certain routes are unreliable. Certain signs indicate danger. Rivers and mountains together would shape movement patterns across Pangea. Routes would form that balanced effort and reward, following water when possible, avoiding steep climbs unless necessary. Over time, these routes would become shared knowledge. This shared geography would not be formalized. There would be no authoritative map, but there would be consensus. People would agree, through experience, on which paths made sense, which regions were worth the effort to reach, which were better avoided. This consensus would be flexible. If conditions changed, routes would adapt. A dried river might be abandoned. A new pass opened by erosion might become favoured. The land itself would participate in shaping civilization's movement. Because rivers and mountains do not conform to human divisions, they encourage a worldview that accepts complexity. A river does not care who lives along it. A mountain does not recognize cultural differences. They impose constraints equally. This can foster humility. You cannot argue with a flood. You cannot negotiate with a storm at high altitude. Survival depends on listening rather than insisting. Over generations, this relationship with geography would influence values. Patience would be rewarded. Awareness would be prized. Overconfidence would be punished. Settlements would emerge where rivers slow, where floodplains offer fertile soil, where mountains provide resources like stone or shelter. These places would become stable not because they were chosen arbitrarily, but because they offered resilience. Yet even stable settlements would remain part of a network. Rivers connect them. Mountain passes allow exchange. No place would be entirely self-sufficient. This interdependence would shape social norms. Hospitality might become important, not as moral virtue alone, but as practical necessity. Travellers rely on local knowledge. Locals rely on travellers for news. Mutual support increases survival odds. In such a world, the idea of fixed borders would struggle to emerge. How do you draw a line across a river that flows and floods? How do you define ownership of a mountain that spans multiple climates and resources? Boundaries would feel artificial, imposed rather than inherent. Instead, influence would fade gradually with distance. Authority would be local. Beyond a certain range, it would dissolve into unfamiliarity rather than resistance. This gradual fading mirrors the landscape itself. Rivers thin into streams. Mountains slope into foothills. There are few sharp edges. The absence of names also affects perception. Without formal names, places are not easily abstracted. You don't think of the mountain range. You think of the long climb after the wide river, the cold ground where fire struggles. This keeps experience grounded. It resists mythologizing too early. Places gain meaning through interaction rather than legend. Over time, some names would emerge, of course, especially for places of repeated importance, major river crossings, reliable mountain passes, resource-rich areas. Names help coordinate memory once populations grow, but even then, names would be descriptive rather than possessive. They would reflect what a place does, not who controls it. As the civilization develops, rivers would likely become focal points for gathering, seasonal meetings, exchanges of goods, shared rituals tied to flooding cycles or animal migrations. These gatherings would reinforce connections across distance. Mountains might become sites of specialized knowledge. Certain groups would become known for understanding high-altitude conditions, others for navigating river deltas. Expertise would distribute geographically. This specialization would not create rigid castes, but it would encourage cooperation. You consult those who know a place best. You listen to experience. All of this reinforces a worldview where land is not segmented into owned parcels, but understood as a continuous system with varied behavior. People adapt to it rather than attempting to dominate it entirely. As Earth's slow tectonic movements continue, rivers will change, courses will shift, mountains will rise or erode. None of this happens quickly enough to alarm, but it does happen persistently. People adapt again. They always do. A river that once connected regions might eventually widen into a shallow sea. A mountain pass might become more treacherous. Movement patterns adjust. At first, these changes feel local, a new crossing needed, a longer detour required. Over generations, though, the cumulative effect becomes significant. Connections that once felt easy begin to feel distant. Shared practices begin to diverge. Stories adapt to new conditions. But for now, in this long early stretch, rivers still run without borders, and mountains still stand without names. They shape life without being owned, guide movement without being controlled, and connect people without requiring agreement. They are simply there, doing what they have always done, while human life weaves itself around them, learning slowly, adapting quietly, and building a civilization that does not yet know how much its world will eventually change. Climate has a way of shaping behavior long before anyone recognizes it as a force. It does not announce itself as an influence. It simply repeats. Day after day, season after season, it rewards certain choices and quietly punishes others. Over time, those patterns harden into habits, and those habits begin to look like culture. On a single, connected Earth, climate would have been one of the strongest threads pulling human behavior towards shared solutions, even across vast distances. In a unified landmass like Pangea, climate would not have been evenly distributed, but it would have been continuous. Heat would intensify gradually as one moved toward the interior. Cold would deepen slowly toward higher latitudes or elevations. Dry regions would blend into semi-arid zones, which would then give way to wetter landscapes. There would be no sudden transition from one climate to another without passing through intermediary conditions. This gradual change matters because it encourages adaptation rather than reinvention. When people move through gradual climate shifts, they do not need to abandon everything they know. They adjust. Clothing changes slowly. Shelter design evolves in steps. Food sources shift incrementally. A technique that works in one place often works well enough in the next, with minor modifications. This continuity allows cultural practices to remain recognizable across distance. Over generations, these small adjustments accumulate into a shared framework. People living far apart might eat different foods or build differently shaped homes, but the underlying logic remains similar. Protection from heat, shelter from cold, storage for scarcity, timing activities around predictable seasonal changes, climate becomes the quiet instructor guiding behaviour toward familiar solutions. In such a world, extreme climates would still exist, particularly in the vast interior of Pangea. Long distances from moderating oceans would create harsher temperature swings. Summers could be punishingly hot, winters bitterly cold. Rainfall would be unreliable in some regions and abundant in others. These challenges would not eliminate human presence, but they would shape where populations clustered and how they moved. People would gravitate toward transitional zones, areas where extremes softened, river valleys that cut through dry land, highland regions that cooled hot plains, coastal margins where temperature swings were gentler. These zones would become cultural bridges, places where practices from different climates overlapped and blended. Living in such transitional regions encourages flexibility. You must be prepared for variation. A year might be wetter than expected, another drier. Crops that thrive one season might struggle the next. Survival depends not on rigid planning, but on responsiveness. This responsiveness becomes cultural. People learn to value adaptability, to store surplus when possible, to diversify food sources, to avoid overcommitting to a single strategy. These values spread because they work under many conditions. On a connected landmass, climate information would travel with people. Someone arriving from a distant region brings stories not just of land, but of weather, of droughts endured, of storms survived, of strategies that failed and those that succeeded. These stories serve as warnings and guidance. Because climates change gradually across space, these lessons remain relevant as they spread. Advice from a slightly drier region applies to a region beginning to dry. Knowledge from a colder area becomes useful as temperatures shift. This creates a shared climatic literacy, not formalized, but widely understood. Seasonality would be one of the strongest unifying forces. Even though seasons manifest differently across latitudes, the concept of cyclical change would be universal. Periods of growth followed by periods of rest, times of abundance followed by times of caution. These rhythms would shape work, movement, and social life everywhere. Shared seasonality encourages synchronized behavior. Certain times of year are for gathering, others for dispersing, some for intense labor, others for conservation. Even without communication, populations across the land mass would often be engaged in similar activities at roughly the same time. This synchronization fosters cultural alignment. Rituals emerge around seasonal transitions. Practices reinforce preparation and restraint. Stories emphasize patience during scarcity and gratitude during abundance. These themes resonate broadly because they reflect lived experience. Climate also shapes risk perception. In environments where conditions can change quickly, caution becomes valued. Overconfidence is punished. Groups that ignore environmental signals suffer. Those that pay attention persist. Over time, attentiveness becomes a cultural trait. This attentiveness extends beyond weather. It influences social behavior. Listening becomes important. Elders are valued not simply for age, but for having experienced variability. Memory of past extremes guides present decisions. In a unified world, climate-driven migrations would be common. When conditions worsen in one region, movement remains an option. People do not need to cross water or invent new technologies. They walk toward better conditions, often following known routes. These migrations are rarely abrupt or total. They unfold over time. A family moves first, others follow, some remain. This gradual movement prevents cultural rupture. Practices travel with people, blending with local ones rather than replacing them. As groups adapt to new climates, they bring their existing cultural framework and modify it. This creates continuity across space. A shared approach to problem-solving persists, even as specific solutions change. Climate extremes also encourage cooperation. In harsh conditions, isolation is dangerous. Sharing resources, information and labour increases survival. This is not altruism in the abstract, it is practical. On a connected landmass, cooperation scales more easily. Networks extend. Assistance can be reciprocal over time rather than immediate. A group helped during drought may later provide guidance or support when conditions reverse. These reciprocal relationships knit cultures together. They create expectations of mutual aid. Violating those expectations carries long-term consequences, because isolation in a variable climate is risky. Climate would also influence the development of belief systems, not as abstract theology, but as frameworks for understanding uncertainty. Why rains fail, why cold lingers, why certain years are harder than others. Stories provide structure where control is limited. On a single Earth, many of these stories would echo similar themes: balance, respect for natural cycles, consequences for excess, rewards for restraint. These themes are reinforced everywhere climate variability is felt. This shared moral ecology does not require coordination. It emerges because similar pressures produce similar responses. Culture converges not because people agree, but because the environment selects for certain behaviours. Over time, architectural styles would reflect climatic adaptation. Building materials chosen for insulation or ventilation, orientation optimised for sun exposure, structures designed to be repaired easily after damage. These principles would be recognisable across regions, even if details differed. Clothing too would follow similar logic: layers, breathable materials, protection against wind or sun. Techniques for warmth or cooling would spread gradually, adapted to local resources. Food practices would align with climate rhythms. Preservation methods for lean seasons, fermentation, drying, storage. These techniques arise independently but spread because they are effective. A unified landmass accelerates this spread. Dietary diversity would be encouraged by climatic unpredictability. Relying on a single food source is risky. Groups that diversify survive better. This leads to broad culinary knowledge and flexible eating habits. All of this contributes to a sense of shared understanding. Not uniformity, but compatibility. People encounter unfamiliar customs, but they recognise the logic behind them. They understand why certain choices are made, even if they do not make them themselves. This recognition reduces friction. Differences feel contextual rather than threatening. Climate teaches humility. It reminds everyone that no strategy is universally superior. What works here may fail there. As centuries pass, climate patterns shift slowly. Long-term trends alter rainfall, temperature, vegetation. These changes happen gradually enough to be absorbed without crisis, but they still reshape settlement patterns. Groups adapt again. Routes shift. Practices evolve. Culture remains flexible because it has always been shaped by change rather than stability. At no point does anyone step back and declare that climate has unified them. The process is invisible from the inside. People simply do what works. They pass along what they learn. They discard what fails. And beneath it all, the shared experience of living under the same sky, enduring cycles of warmth and cold, abundance and scarcity, builds a quiet common ground. A sense that life is shaped by forces larger than any group, and that surviving those forces requires attention, patience, and cooperation. As the Earth continues its slow tectonic movements, climates will eventually diverge more sharply. Oceans will form. Currents will alter temperature distributions. Regions once similar will grow distinct. But during this long early period, while land remains connected and climate gradients remain continuous, a unified culture is not imposed. It is cultivated by repetition, by shared challenges, by the steady pressure of a world that rewards those who learn to move with it rather than against it. This is how climate shapes culture quietly, persistently, and deeply. not through single events, but through patterns lived long enough to feel natural. And it is within this shared climatic rhythm that a unified civilization could take root, not as a monolith, but as a network of people who understand, at a fundamental level, how to live within the same breathing, changing world. At some point, without ceremony or announcement, staying in one place for longer begins to feel normal. It does not happen because someone decides to build a city. It happens because returning to the same ground again and again becomes easier than leaving it behind. In a world without edges, where land stretches continuously in every direction, the first cities would not rise as bold statements of permanence. They would emerge quietly, almost accidentally, as pauses in motion that lasted just a little longer each time. In the earlier stages, there would be nothing that looked like a city in the modern sense. No walls, no grids, no clear separation between living space and the surrounding land. There would be places where people tended to linger, a river bend where flooding left fertile soil behind, a crossroads where multiple walking routes naturally converged, a sheltered basin where weather felt slightly less severe than elsewhere. These places would attract repeated use long before they acquired any special meaning. At first, people would arrive, stay for a season, and move on. Then they would return the following year, remembering that this place worked. Over time, temporary structures would become more substantial, not because anyone planned permanence, but because rebuilding from scratch each time wasted effort. A shelter reinforced rather than dismantled, a storage pit reused, a firing cleaned instead of abandoned. The difference between a camp and a city is not intention, it is duration. As stays lengthened, patterns would emerge. Certain areas used for sleeping, others for food preparation, others for tool making. These patterns would not be enforced. They would arise because they made daily life easier. Smoke drifts less this way. Noise bothers fewer people that way. Refuse is easier to manage over there. Gradually, space organizes itself. In a world without edges, these early settlements would not feel like endpoints. They would feel like nodes, places you pass through, places you return to, places where paths intersect. Their importance would come from movement, not from containment. People would still arrive from many directions. Travellers would still come and go. The idea of residency would be flexible. Some people would stay longer. Others would pass through. Identity would not be tied strictly to location. You belong to a network more than to a spot. This fluidity shapes how early cities function. Without rigid boundaries, they remain open. Anyone arriving with useful skills, information or connections would be valuable. Exclusion would be rare, not out of idealism but practicality. In a connected world, turning people away reduces access to what they carry. As population slowly increased, specialization would become possible. When enough people gather in one place for long enough, not everyone needs to do everything. Someone becomes particularly good at shaping stone, another at working fibers, another at organizing food storage. These roles are not formalized. They are recognized through repetition and reliance. Specialization increases efficiency, but it also increases interdependence. A city forms not because it is self-sufficient, but because it allows people to rely on one another. This reliance encourages stability. You stay because others depend on you, and you depend on them. In a world without edges, specialization would not lock people into rigid social classes early on. Movement remains possible. If a role becomes restrictive or conditions change, people can leave. This prevents extreme hierarchy from forming too quickly. Power remains distributed, negotiated through relationships rather than enforced through territory. Early cities would also function as information hubs. Travellers bring news of distant conditions, weather patterns, resource availability, conflicts elsewhere, innovations observed far away. This information would be exchanged casually, not formally, but its value would be recognized. Knowing that a drought is spreading in one direction, or that animal migrations have shifted, could influence decisions locally. Cities would become places where broader awareness concentrates, not because they control information, but because information naturally pools where people gather. Food production would change noticeably in these settings. While hunting and gathering would remain important, proximity encourages experimentation. People try planting near their dwellings. They observe which plants thrive. They protect useful species. Over time, deliberate cultivation emerges, not as a revolution, but as refinement. Farming in a connected world would spread gradually. Techniques would travel along human networks. A method that works in one region would be tested elsewhere, adapted to local conditions. Cities accelerate this process by concentrating experimentation and observation. Storage becomes more sophisticated as well. When people remain in one place, surplus matters. You prepare not just for tomorrow, but for months ahead. Storage structures become more robust. Preservation techniques improve. This creates resilience, which further encourages people to stay. Architecture evolves alongside these needs. Buildings become sturdier, not taller. Materials are chosen for durability rather than portability. Designs reflect climate adaptation learned over generations. Ventilation, insulation, drainage, all refined through experience rather than theory. Without edges, cities would not be defensive by default. Walls arise when separation and threat become dominant concerns. In an open landmass with fluid movement, constant fortification is inefficient. Instead, safety comes from social networks, alliances, mutual dependence, reputation. Conflict still occurs, but it is managed locally. A city that gains a reputation for hostility risks isolation, not siege. Others reroute. Trade declines. Information bypasses it. In a connected world, exclusion is costly. This dynamic encourages moderation. Cities grow by being useful, not by being intimidating. They attract people by offering resources, knowledge, and opportunity. The scale of early cities would remain modest for a long time. Growth is limited by logistics, food production, water access, waste management. Without advanced infrastructure, density can only increase so far. But even small cities can be culturally influential. Because cities act as meeting points, they become places where ideas blend. Beliefs encountered from different regions are compared. Practices are tested. Some persist. Others fade. Cities function as filters, not because they impose standards, but because repeated interaction favours what works across contexts. Language would shift subtly in these spaces. Dialects mix. Vocabulary expands. Words for abstract concepts begin to stabilise because shared understanding becomes necessary. Trade, cooperation, and coordination require clarity. Rituals also evolve in cities. Not elaborate ceremonies, but repeated social practices. Shared meals, seasonal gatherings, simple observances tied to agricultural cycles or environmental markers. These rituals reinforce cohesion without demanding uniformity. Cities would also become places where memory accumulates. Not written memory at first, but embodied memory. Elders who remember past cycles. Structures that persist long enough to carry stories. Locations associated with significant events. This accumulation creates a sense of continuity. People begin to feel that something exists beyond individual lifespans. Not an abstract civilization, but a place that has endured change. In a world without edges, this sense of continuity does not translate into dominance. A city does not imagine itself as the centre of the world. It knows that others exist beyond it. It understands itself as one among many nodes in a vast network. This humility influences governance. Authority remains pragmatic. Decisions are made based on immediate needs rather than grand visions. Leadership is situational, not absolute. Those with relevant experience are listened to. Authority shifts as conditions change. As cities persist, they begin to influence their surroundings more intentionally. Nearby land is managed to support population. Paths are maintained. water flow is guided gently. These interventions remain limited by technology and knowledge, but they mark a shift towards shaping environment rather than merely responding to it. Still, the land retains the upper hand. Floods reshape layouts, droughts force adaptation. Cities survive by adjusting, not by resisting completely. Over long spans of time, some cities would grow more prominent than others. Their location favours them, their resources are abundant, their networks are strong. These cities become reference points in stories, places others know about even if they have never visited. Yet even the most prominent cities remain vulnerable. Without edges, influence cannot be fully controlled. Power diffuses naturally along routes of movement. Attempts to dominate large regions would stretch resources thin and invite instability. This keeps early urban life grounded. Growth is balanced by awareness of limits. Expansion happens when it makes sense, not because it is expected. As Earth continues its slow tectonic changes, some cities would find themselves closer to emerging bodies of water. Rivers widen, lowlands flood seasonally. Adaptation becomes necessary again. Some cities relocate gradually, others shrink, some disappear quietly. Cities are not immortal in this world. They are phases, expressions of stability within a moving system. Yet their influence persists. Practices developed there spread outward. Knowledge refined their travels with people who leave. Even when a city fades, its imprint remains in the broader culture. In a world without edges, cities are not monuments to permanence. They are experiments in cooperation, temporary concentrations of human effort responding to favourable conditions. Their emergence marks a shift, not an endpoint. Life becomes more organised, more interconnected, but not rigid. Movement remains normal, change remains expected, and while people gather, build and adapt, the deeper movements of the planet continue unnoticed. Land stretches thin, water presses in, routes that once connected easily will one day be interrupted. For now, though, the first cities exist as open places, shaped by rivers, climate, and human need rather than by ambition. They sit lightly on the land, unaware that the very ground supporting them is slowly preparing to redraw the meaning of connection itself. Before distance hardened into separation, before oceans widened enough to silence footsteps and break contact, language would have moved the same way people did, slowly, continuously, without clear beginnings or endings. In a world where land stretched on without interruption, speech would not splinter quickly. It would drift, bend and adapt, but it would remain recognisably connected across immense spans of ground. Language, in its earliest forms, does not aim for precision. It aims for usefulness. It grows out of repeated needs, warnings, requests, instructions, reassurance. On a connected Earth, those needs would be broadly similar across regions. People everywhere must describe weather, terrain, food, danger, movement, and cooperation. The shared environment creates shared priorities, and shared priorities encourage shared structures and communication. In the absence of long-term isolation, these structures would persist. Sounds would shift gradually as groups moved and settled. Accents would emerge, not as markers of identity, but as natural byproducts of repetition in slightly different conditions. Certain consonants become easier to pronounce in dry air. Certain rhythms align better with communal work. These changes accumulate slowly enough that mutual understanding remains possible. This continuity matters. When communication does not break down completely, culture does not fragment sharply. Differences remain negotiable, meaning remains transferable. A traveller arriving from far away might sound unfamiliar, but their intent would still be readable. Context fills the gaps. Early language would be deeply tied to action. Words describe what is done rather than what is abstract. To move, to gather, to wait, to share, to avoid. These verbs anchor communication in shared experience. Even nouns remain flexible. defined by function rather than fixed categories. A shelter is what keeps out wind. Food is what sustains. A tool is what works. If an object changes form but serves the same purpose, the word follows function rather than shape. This functional approach allows language to adapt easily as technology and practices evolve. On a single landmass, this adaptability allows vocabulary to spread widely. When a useful concept emerges, a word travels with it. Not instantly, not unchanged, but persistently. Over generations, people far apart might use related words for similar ideas, even if pronunciation differs. Grammar too would reflect shared patterns. Ways of indicating time, intention, and relationship would develop based on common needs. Telling someone what has already happened, what is happening now, and what is expected to happen soon matters everywhere. So does expressing obligation, permission, and warning. These structures would stabilize early because they solve recurring problems. They are reinforced constantly through use. Language becomes reliable not because it is standardized, but because it is practiced. Without writing, memory plays a central role. Language must be easy to remember. This favors repetition, rhythm, and pattern, but not in a poetic sense, in a practical one. Instructions are repeated often enough to stick. Stories follow familiar structures because those structures are easier to recall. This does not create uniformity, it creates compatibility. Different groups develop variations, but those variations fit within a shared framework. Understanding requires attention, not translation. Movement reinforces this compatibility. When people travel, they adjust their speech slightly. They borrow words that work better. They adopt expressions that convey meaning more efficiently in certain contexts. Over time, this borrowing smooths sharp edges. In a world without edges, there is little incentive for deliberate linguistic separation. No group needs to make itself incomprehensible to assert independence. Identity is expressed through practice, not exclusion. This does not mean conflict disappears. Arguments still happen, disagreements still arise, but language remains a bridge rather than a barrier. Even insults rely on shared understanding. As settlements grow more stable and cities begin to form, language gains new roles. Coordination becomes more complex. Describing quantities, schedules, and responsibilities becomes important. New terms emerge to manage these needs. Yet even then, abstraction remains grounded. Numbers are tied to tangible things. Time is described in relation to cycles rather than exact units. Authority is expressed through context rather than titles. Language remains flexible enough to accommodate growth without rigidifying too early. This flexibility allows it to survive environmental and social change. Children learn language through immersion rather than instruction. They absorb patterns by listening and participating. Correction happens through response rather than explanation. This reinforces continuity across generations. Because people move often, children hear multiple variations of speech. This exposure builds tolerance for difference. Understanding becomes an active process. You listen for meaning rather than exact form. This listening culture shapes social interaction. People become attuned to tone, context, and intent. Misunderstandings are resolved through clarification rather than dismissal. Communication is a skill valued for its effectiveness, not its conformity. Over time, metaphors emerge from shared experience. Rivers become ways of talking about continuity. Seasons become ways of describing change. Movement becomes a way of explaining progress. These metaphors travel easily because they are rooted in common reality. As long as the land remains connected, these metaphors remain intelligible. A river behaves like a river everywhere. Seasons change everywhere. Walking means the same thing everywhere. Shared environment stabilizes shared meaning. This shared meaning allows stories to travel far. A story told in one region can be retold elsewhere with minimal adjustment. Names change, details shift, but the structure holds. Stories preserve language by giving it purpose beyond immediate action. They reinforce vocabulary. They demonstrate grammar in context. They encode lessons in memorable forms. In early civilization, stories also serve as repositories of social norms. They illustrate consequences. They model cooperation. They warn against behaviours that disrupt group stability. Language becomes a vehicle for cultural continuity. Because distance does not yet isolate, stories cross regions before diverging significantly. Similar narrative patterns appear across vast areas. Themes repeat. Characters resemble one another in function, if not in name. This does not require coordination. It emerges because people face similar challenges and share solutions through communication. As populations increase and cities become more prominent, language begins to diversify more noticeably. Density encourages innovation. New concepts require new words. Specialized roles generate specialized vocabulary. Even then, the underlying structure remains shared. A new word introduced in one place can spread if it proves useful. Others adopt it, adapt it, or merge it with existing terms. Language becomes a living network rather than a collection of isolated systems. Only when distance becomes separation does this network begin to fragment. As tectonic forces slowly pull land apart and water fills the gaps, movement becomes more difficult. Routes that once connected communities now require new technologies or become impassable. Communication slows. Contact becomes sporadic. Words that once travelled easily now remain local. Pronunciations drift further. Meanings shift without correction. Over generations, mutual intelligibility weakens. Languages that were once variations of one another become distinct. Shared metaphors lose clarity. Stories diverge more dramatically. But in this earlier time, before oceans impose silence, language remains fluid and connected. It changes, but it does not break. It adapts, but it does not isolate. This continuity shapes thought itself. When ideas can travel without translation, concepts spread more easily. Practices align. Values converge subtly. People may not think of themselves as sharing a language. They simply speak. They understand. They adjust when needed. The absence of barriers makes flexibility normal. As with so many aspects of this early world, the significance of this linguistic unity would not be recognized from within. No one would remark on how remarkable it is that people across vast distances can still communicate. It would simply be how the world works. Only later, when separation becomes the norm and misunderstanding becomes common, would the memory of this continuity fade into myth. Stories of a time when everyone could understand one another would appear, stripped of context, reinterpreted as legend. But beneath those later stories would lie a simple truth. When land connects, language connects. When movement is possible, understanding persists. And as people continue to gather, build and adapt, speaking to one another across distances still bridged by land, language quietly does its work, holding culture together just long enough for more complex patterns to form before distance finally begins to pull it apart. When people imagine early trade, they often picture boats first, canoes hugging coastlines, rafts drifting along rivers, sails catching uncertain winds. Water feels like the obvious highway of the past. But on a world where land connects everything, trade does not begin with ships. It begins with feet, patience, and the quiet understanding that value moves as slowly as people do. In a single, continuous landmass, exchange does not depend on daring crossings or specialized technology. It depends on proximity, repetition, and trust built over time. Trade without oceans is not dramatic. It is steady. It does not announce itself as commerce. It begins as sharing, then turns into expectation, and only much later becomes something recognizable as a system. The earliest exchanges would happen almost without intention. Someone arrives carrying a tool shaped differently than usual. Another notices it works better for a specific task. They ask how it was made. They try to copy it. Perhaps they offer something in return: food, help, shelter. No ledger is kept. No balance is calculated, but a pattern begins to form. As movement continues across Pangea, these small exchanges accumulate. People notice that certain regions produce materials not found elsewhere: a particular stone that holds an edge longer, clay that fires well, fibres that resist wear, pigments that do not fade quickly. These materials become desirable not because they are rare everywhere, but because they are locally abundant somewhere. Without oceans to block routes, these materials can move outward slowly but persistently. A stone blade might change hands dozens of times, each transfer separated by days or weeks of walking. By the time it reaches a distant region, it may have travelled hundreds of kilometres without ever crossing water. This kind of movement creates a different relationship with objects. Items that travel far carry stories. Not myths, but context. Someone knows where it came from because they know who passed it to them, who got it from someone else, and so on. Distance is measured socially rather than geographically. Trade routes in this world would not be straight lines. They would be networks of overlapping paths shaped by terrain, climate, and habit. Rivers guide movement. Valleys ease passage. Mountain passes concentrate traffic. Over time, certain routes become preferred not because they are shortest, but because they are reliable. Reliability matters more than speed when journeys take weeks or months. A route that offers water, shelter, and predictable conditions will be favoured even if it adds distance. This preference shapes trade patterns. Goods move along paths of least risk rather than least length. Because trade is slow, it is also resilient. Disruption in one area does not collapse the system. If a route becomes difficult, goods reroute through neighbouring paths. No single corridor dominates. The network adapts organically. This distributed nature prevents monopolies from forming early. No group can easily control the flow of goods across a continent. Influence spreads through relationships rather than choke points. This keeps trade cooperative rather than extractive. Journeys without ships also shape who trades. Trade is not the domain of a specialised class early on. Everyone moves. Everyone carries something. A traveller brings goods simply because they are already walking that way. Trade piggybacks on movement rather than requiring separate expeditions. Over time, some individuals become known for travelling farther or more often. Not merchants in the formal sense, but connectors. People who know multiple regions, who speak multiple dialects, who understand how conditions shift across distance. Their value lies not in what they carry, but in what they know. These connectors play a crucial role. They reduce uncertainty. They bring news of abundance or scarcity. They introduce new techniques. They warn of hazards. Their presence increases trust between distant groups because familiarity replaces speculation. Trust is the real currency of early trade. Without contracts or enforcement, exchange relies on reputation. A group known for fairness attracts partners. One known for deception finds itself bypassed. This reputation spreads slowly but persistently. Stories travel with people. A bad experience in one place may echo across a region over generations. Conversely, reliability becomes a long-term asset. Trade without oceans also means trade without sudden shocks. There are no shipwrecks wiping out entire cargoes, no storms erasing years of accumulation in a moment. Losses occur, but they are incremental. A broken tool, spoiled food, a journey cut short. The system absorbs these without collapse. This gradualism influences economic thinking. There is little incentive to gamble. Risk is managed through redundancy and diversification rather than bold ventures. Value accumulates slowly. As settlements grow into early cities, trade becomes more concentrated. Cities act as gathering points where goods from multiple regions intersect, not because they demand tribute, but because their location makes exchange convenient. In these places, People encounter unfamiliar materials more frequently. This exposure drives innovation. Seeing how others use resources sparks adaptation. A technique used for one material inspires application to another. Cities also encourage standardization, though informally. Certain measures become common simply because they facilitate exchange. A basket of known size, a bundle of known weight. These standards are not imposed. They emerge because they reduce friction. Yet even as trade grows more complex, it remains grounded in human scale. Journeys are planned around seasons. Loads are limited by what a person or animal can carry. Exchange is paced by walking speed. This pacing shapes expectations. No one expects immediate fulfillment. Needs are anticipated well in advance. Storage and patience become essential skills. The absence of ships also limits the volume of goods. Trade focuses on high-value, low-bulk items. Tools, knowledge, seeds, techniques. Perishable goods rarely travel far unless preserved. This emphasis influences cultural priorities. Knowledge becomes one of the most traded commodities. How to shape stone, how to manage water, how to cultivate certain plants. These things weigh nothing and travel easily. As knowledge spreads, regions become more compatible. Practices align. Tools become interoperable. A blade from one region fits a handle from another. Techniques build upon shared foundations. Journeys without ships also mean journeys that are visible. A caravan walking across land is seen by many. Its movement leaves traces, campsites, worn paths, stories. This visibility discourages secrecy. Trade happens in the open. Open trade reinforces accountability. If someone cheats, word spreads. If someone behaves generously, that too is remembered. Transparency becomes the norm. Because movement is continuous, trade never fully stops. Even in difficult times, small exchanges persist. A traveller brings news even if they bring nothing else. Information continues to flow. Over long periods, this steady exchange knits regions together economically without creating dependence. No area relies entirely on distant goods for survival. Trade enhances life, but does not replace local resilience. This balance is crucial. It prevents collapse when conditions change. When routes are disrupted by environmental shifts, communities fall back on local knowledge rather than failing entirely. As tectonic forces slowly reshape the land, trade networks adjust. A river widens, a lowland floods seasonally, a route becomes less reliable. People adapt, they find alternatives. The system bends rather than breaks. At first, these changes are minor inconveniences, a longer walk, a different season for travel. But over generations they accumulate. Paths that once connected easily now require detours. Distances feel longer. Familiar routes become uncertain. This gradual friction changes trade patterns subtly. Exchange slows between certain regions. Local specialization increases. Variations in practice become more pronounced. Still, the memory of connection persists. People remember that trade was once easier. Stories recall journeys that no longer seem practical. These memories shape expectations and responses. Trade without oceans fosters a worldview where connection is assumed. Distance is a challenge, not a barrier. Effort bridges gaps. Patience overcomes separation. When oceans eventually intrude, this worldview is disrupted. Suddenly, some distances cannot be walked. Some connections require new technology. Trade becomes episodic rather than continuous. But before that shift during this long early period, trade remains grounded in land, time, and trust. Journeys are undertaken because people move, not because markets demand it. The value exchanged is not measured in accumulation alone, but in stability. A system that endures, relationships that persist, knowledge that spreads without erasing local identity. This form of trade does not produce sudden wealth or towering hierarchies. It produces resilience. It produces compatibility. It produces a shared understanding of how value moves through a connected world. And as people continue to walk carrying goods, ideas, and stories from one horizon to the next, trade remains an extension of movement itself, not a separate activity, but part of living on a land that still allows every journey to begin on foot, without ships, without sails, and without the knowledge that this ease of connection will one day be lost. Knowledge does not appear fully formed. It accumulates the way soil does, layer by layer, built from countless small contributions that rarely feel significant on their own. On a whole Earth, where land remains connected and movement is possible in every direction, knowledge would grow differently than it does in a fractured world. It would spread more evenly, adapt more gradually, and resist sharp division. Not because people are more enlightened, but because the conditions favour continuity over isolation. In the earlier stages, knowledge would be inseparable from survival. What keeps you alive is what you know. Where to find water, which plants nourish, and which harm, how weather behaves before it changes. These things are learned through direct experience, reinforced through repetition, and shared because withholding them offers little advantage. On a connected landmass, such practical knowledge would travel far, not quickly, but persistently, carried by people moving through familiar routes. Because people can walk between regions without encountering impassable barriers, knowledge does not remain trapped. A useful technique discovered in one area does not need to be reinvented elsewhere. It arrives eventually, altered by context but recognizable. Over generations, this creates a shared baseline of understanding across enormous distances. This baseline does not make everyone the same, it makes everyone compatible. People understand similar principles even when their applications differ. They know why something works, not just that it does. This shared reasoning allows adaptation when conditions change. One of the first areas where this becomes apparent is in environmental knowledge. On a whole Earth, people would encounter gradual transitions between ecosystems rather than abrupt shifts. This encourages comparative thinking. You notice how the same plant behaves differently in slightly wetter soil. You observe how animals alter migration routes as terrain changes. These observations accumulate into an intuitive sense of ecological systems. This systems thinking does not emerge as theory. It emerges as pattern recognition. You learn that changes ripple outward, that what happens upstream affects downstream, that overuse in one place has consequences elsewhere. Because people move and share stories, these patterns are reinforced across regions. Over time, this produces a cautious approach to resource use. Not necessarily conservation as a moral ideal, but restraint as a learned response. Groups that overexploit an area experience consequences and move on, carrying those lessons with them. Others listen. The knowledge spreads. On a connected landmass, mistakes are not isolated. Their outcomes are observed by others. This shared observation accelerates learning. You do not need to make every error yourself. You can avoid some by listening. Technological knowledge would also grow steadily. Tool-making techniques improve through incremental refinement rather than sudden leaps. A better grip, a sharper edge, a more durable binding. These improvements spread gradually as tools are seen, handled, and replicated. Because trade moves slowly, technology remains understandable. You see not just the finished tool, but the steps that led to it. This transparency allows learning rather than dependency. People adapt techniques to local materials rather than copying blindly. This adaptability is key. Knowledge that travels across a whole Earth must be flexible to survive. Techniques that rely on specific conditions fail elsewhere. Those that work under varied circumstances persist. Over time, this selects for generalizable knowledge. The same applies to agriculture. Early cultivation practices would spread along climate gradients. A method developed in one region would be tested in neighbouring areas. It would be adjusted for soil, rainfall and temperature. What survives is not a rigid recipe, but an approach. People learn principles rather than prescriptions. timing matters, soil health matters, water management matters. These ideas remain useful even as specific crops change. This principle-based knowledge is easier to transmit across distance. As settlements become more stable and cities begin to form, knowledge density increases. People with different experiences gather. Comparisons become possible. Why does this method work there but not here? What changes when conditions shift? These questions arise naturally. Cities act as mixing chambers for knowledge, not because they enforce learning, but because proximity encourages conversation. Someone mentions a technique used elsewhere. Another points out a flaw. A third suggests an adaptation. Knowledge evolves through dialogue rather than decree. This dialogue is not formal. There are no classrooms or curricula. Learning happens through demonstration, discussion, and imitation. Expertise is recognized through effectiveness, not credentials. Those who solve problems are listened to. Over time, certain individuals become repositories of knowledge, not specialists in narrow fields, but generalists with broad experience, travellers, elders, craftspeople who have seen multiple contexts. Their value lies in synthesis rather than novelty. On a whole Earth, synthesis is easier because information flows continuously. You can compare experiences across regions without waiting generations. This reduces redundancy. People build on existing knowledge rather than repeating the same discoveries in isolation. This does not eliminate innovation. It redirects it. Innovation focuses on integration rather than invention. Combining techniques, refining processes, applying ideas in new contexts. Language plays a crucial role here. When communication remains possible across distance, concepts can be discussed rather than merely observed. Explanations accompany techniques. Reasoning is shared. This deepens understanding. Shared language also allows for abstraction to develop gradually. People begin to talk not just about specific events, but about tendencies, patterns, causes. This is the foundation of systematic thought. For example, people may not formalize meteorology, but they recognize signs that precede certain weather patterns. They share these signs. Over time, a collective understanding emerges that transcends individual experience. The same applies to medicine. Remedies are tested, some work, others fail. Observations are shared. Practices that consistently help persist. Those that harm are abandoned. Because people move and communicate, effective remedies spread. This shared medical knowledge remains empirical. It is grounded in observation rather than theory. But it becomes surprisingly robust through repetition and cross-context testing. On a whole Earth, belief systems also shape knowledge. Stories explain phenomena that are not fully understood. These explanations vary, but they often encode practical advice. Respect certain places, avoid certain behaviours, observe certain cycles. Because environments are broadly similar across regions, these stories remain relevant. They travel easily. Over time, shared motifs emerge. Balance, reciprocity, consequences of excess. These themes reinforce adaptive behaviour. Importantly, knowledge growth in this world is cumulative but not centralised. There is no single authority defining truth. Instead, consensus emerges through repeated confirmation. If something works across many contexts, it is trusted. This distributed validation makes knowledge resilient. No single failure undermines the whole system. Errors are corrected locally and lessons spread. As long as the land remains connected, this process continues. Knowledge grows outward like a web rather than upward like a tower. It connects nodes rather than accumulating at a centre. This has social consequences. Power based on exclusive knowledge is harder to maintain. Secrets travel poorly when people move freely. Those who attempt to hoard knowledge risk irrelevance as others discover or share alternatives. As a result, prestige is tied to contribution rather than control. Those who teach, demonstrate and adapt knowledge gain respect. Those who obstruct it lose influence. Over long spans of time, this encourages a culture that values learning as a shared endeavour. Not everyone is equal in expertise, but everyone participates in the process. As the Earth slowly begins to change, as tectonic forces introduce new barriers, this dynamic shifts. Knowledge that once travelled easily now moves more slowly. Regions begin to diverge. Local solutions become more specialised. But before that fragmentation, there is a long period where knowledge grows in a connected environment, where learning is collective, where adaptation is shared, where understanding deepens through exposure rather than isolation. This does not create a utopia. People still make mistakes, conflicts still arise, knowledge is still incomplete, but the structure favours correction over entrenchment. The absence of edges means fewer dead ends. When an idea fails, alternatives exist nearby. When conditions change, people can learn from others who have already faced similar challenges. This creates a subtle confidence, not arrogance, but trust in the process, a sense that problems can be addressed through observation, sharing, and adjustment. As generations pass, this accumulated knowledge becomes invisible. It feels like common sense. People do not marvel at how much they know. They simply use it. Only later, when separation increases and knowledge fragments, will the value of this shared growth become apparent. When misunderstandings arise, when solutions diverge sharply, when communication breaks down, in hindsight, the knowledge that grew on a whole Earth will appear unusually coherent. Similar principles appearing across distant cultures, comparable practices emerging independently, echoes of a shared foundation. But from within that time, it would feel ordinary, just life, lived attentively on a land that allowed learning to travel as freely as people did. Nothing breaks all at once when it comes to the Earth. There is no single moment when the ground announces its intention to separate, no crack loud enough to wake a civilization, no warning that what has always been continuous is beginning to drift apart. The long, slow sound of the world breaking apart is not something you hear with your ears. It is something that unfolds beneath generations, quiet enough to be mistaken for normal change. For people living on a whole Earth, the land would feel stable in the only way that matters to a human lifetime. Mountains remain where they have always been. Rivers still follow familiar courses. Paths that grandparents walked remain walkable for grandchildren. From the inside, the world feels steady, dependable, almost timeless. The idea that the ground itself could be moving, stretching, thinning, would not exist as a concept worth considering. And yet, far below the surface, forces are at work that do not care about human perception. Heat circulates, pressure builds. The crust responds slowly, flexing and pulling, like a material that appears solid only because it moves on a timescale far longer than a life. The first signs of separation would not feel like catastrophe. They would feel like inconvenience. A river that floods more often than it used to. A lowland that stays marshy longer into the dry season. An earthquake that feels slightly stronger than remembered, then fades back into story. These are not endings. They are adjustments. People would respond the way they always have. They would adapt, move slightly uphill, reinforce shelters, avoid certain routes during certain times of year. The changes are absorbed into daily life without demanding explanation. Over generations, these adjustments accumulate. A settlement shifts its centre of activity away from a flood-prone area. A route that once crossed firm ground now detours around soft soil. A familiar landscape becomes subtly unfamiliar, not suddenly but persistently. Because the land is vast and connected, these changes do not isolate anyone at first. Movement remains possible. If one area becomes less hospitable, another lies within reach. The world still feels open. The idea of being trapped does not arise. What begins to change quietly is predictability. Patterns that once repeated reliably begin to drift. Seasonal floods arrive earlier or later than expected. Dry periods linger longer. Certain plants struggle where they once thrived. Animals alter migration routes in small but noticeable ways. People notice. They talk about it. Elders remark that things feel different than they used to. Stories adapt. New explanations are woven in. The land is restless. The spirits are unsettled. Balance has shifted. These narratives do not need to be accurate to be functional. They encourage caution and attention. Attention becomes more important as conditions grow less familiar. Knowledge that once seemed sufficient now needs revision. People rely more heavily on observation than on memory alone. This fosters experimentation, new planting strategies, new building techniques, new movement patterns. In this way, the slow breaking apart of the world does not immediately weaken civilization. In some respects, it strengthens adaptability. Flexibility has always been a survival trait. Now it becomes essential. The physical process underlying all of this remains imperceptible. Plates stretch and thin beneath the surface. Magma rises slowly. The crust weakens along long, shallow zones that will one day become ocean basins. But for now, these zones manifest as rifts, valleys, chains of lakes, areas where the ground behaves differently. People might come to associate these regions with instability. Not fear exactly, but respect. You do not build permanent structures there. You pass through when necessary. You adjust routes. These decisions are practical, not prophetic. Over very long spans of time, water begins to collect more persistently in these low-lying areas. Lakes grow, marshes deepen. Seasonal flooding becomes permanent flooding in some places. What was once land that could be crossed part of the year becomes something you walk around instead. This is a turning point, though it would not be recognized as one. Movement patterns begin to change in more significant ways. Detours lengthen journeys. Familiar connections require more effort to maintain. Some routes are used less frequently. Still, no one thinks in terms of separation. The land remains connected. You can still walk around obstacles. It just takes longer. Trade adapts accordingly. Goods reroute. Exchange slows between certain regions while remaining strong elsewhere. This unevenness introduces subtle differences in development. Some areas receive new ideas more slowly. Others become more locally focused. Language begins to drift a little more. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Pronunciations diverge. Certain words fall out of use in one place while persisting in another. Mutual understanding remains, but it requires more attention. Cultural practices begin to specialize. Rituals tied to local conditions gain prominence. Stories emphasize regional experiences more than shared ones. The shared sky remains, but the shared land feels less uniform. The sound of the world breaking apart is not a crash. It is a long exhale. As rifts widen further, some become impassable during certain seasons. Water deepens, ground softens. What was once a temporary obstacle becomes a persistent one. People adjust again. Routes that once connected communities easily now feel distant. This distance changes relationships, not abruptly but gradually. Visits become less frequent. Information arrives later. News that once travelled in months now takes years. The sense of immediacy fades. With distance comes reinterpretation. Stories arriving from far away are retold with more variation. Details blur, explanations diverge. Without frequent correction, differences persist. This is how separation begins culturally, long before it becomes absolute geographically. Cities near these changing regions face choices. Some adapt by relocating slowly, following more stable ground. Others remain and adjust their livelihoods to new conditions, turning marsh into resource, water into pathway. Some decline quietly as movement bypasses them. None of this feels like loss in the moment. It feels like change, the same kind of change people have always dealt with. But the scale is larger, even if the pace is slow. As water continues to accumulate, channels deepen, lakes connect, shallow seas begin to form. At first, they are narrow enough to walk around without great hardship. Later, detours become substantial. For the first time, the idea that land might truly end in a way that cannot be walked around begins to emerge. Not fully formed, but hinted at. People notice that certain areas feel increasingly inaccessible. Still, there is no urgency. Generations pass between noticeable changes. Children grow up knowing only the current landscape. What feels new to elders feels normal to them. This generational reset is crucial. It prevents panic. It allows adaptation to continue without overwhelming disruption. Each generation accepts the world as it is, not as it was. The slow sound of breaking becomes part of the background. Eventually, water reaches the sea. The first narrow ocean begins to form. At first, it feels like an extended river or a very wide lake. People adapt familiar strategies. They follow shorelines. They build simple rafts across narrow points. Movement continues, though more cautiously. This is a profound shift, even if it is not immediately recognized as such. For the first time, land connection is no longer guaranteed everywhere. Some routes now require new solutions. Those solutions do not appear instantly. Raft building, simple boating, experimentation with flotation all emerge gradually. These technologies are practical responses, not revolutionary leaps. Still, they change who can travel and how. Crossing water requires different skills than walking. It introduces new risks. Not everyone attempts it. As a result, some connections weaken further. Groups on opposite sides of widening water interact less frequently. Cultural drift accelerates. Knowledge that once spread evenly now pools locally. Practices diverge. Innovations emerge independently rather than being shared quickly. The world is no longer entirely whole, even if it still feels mostly connected. From a planetary perspective, this process is just beginning. Oceans will widen dramatically over tens of millions of years. Continents will drift far apart. But from a human perspective, the critical shift has already occurred. The assumption of continuous land has been broken. That assumption shaped everything: movement, trade, language, knowledge, culture. Its gradual erosion changes all of them. Yet even now the breaking is gentle. No cities fall into the sea overnight. No civilizations collapse in a single generation. Instead, there is reorientation. People living near new coastlines develop different relationships with water. They learn tides, currents, fishing techniques. Boat building improves. Water becomes pathway rather than barrier for some. Others retreat inland, preferring familiar land-based movement. Their world contracts slightly, focusing more on local networks. This divergence marks the beginning of truly separate trajectories. Cultures that adapt to water develop differently than those that do not. Technologies specialize, values shift. But memory of connection persists for a long time. Stories recall a time when you could walk far without interruption, when routes were simpler, when contact was easier. These stories may become mythologized, a golden age of closeness, a time of unity. They are not entirely accurate, but they carry emotional truth. The long, slow sound of the world breaking apart is, in the end, the sound of assumptions changing. The assumption that land is continuous, that movement is always possible, that connection is inevitable. As those assumptions fade, new ones take their place. Water becomes part of life. Separation becomes normal. Distance acquires new meaning. But none of this happens suddenly. None of it feels like an ending. It feels like a continuation under new conditions. People still wake with the sun. They still work, trade, tell stories, raise children. Life goes on, shaped by a planet that is doing what it has always done, only now in a way that begins to matter more deeply to those living upon it. And as the land continues to stretch and water continues to intrude, the world moves quietly from one state into another, carrying its early civilization with it, not as something shattered, but as something slowly, almost imperceptibly transformed. There is a moment in any long process of change when continuity gives way to distance, not sharply, not with a clear dividing line, but softly enough that it takes time to notice what has been lost. When continents drifted and memories scattered, that moment did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as an accumulation of absences, fewer visits, longer journeys, stories that arrived altered in small ways that no one bothered to correct. By the time land truly separated, the assumption of togetherness had already weakened. For generations, people had adapted to a world that changed beneath them. Rivers shifted, coastlines crept, marshlands expanded. None of this felt existential. It felt like the earth behaving the way it always had, slowly and unevenly. But as water widened and roots lengthened, something more subtle began to unravel. Not infrastructure, not survival. Memory. Memory depends on repetition, on reinforcement, on stories being told often enough, accurately enough, by enough people who can still compare versions. When contact becomes less frequent, memory begins to drift the way language does, the way accents do, the way customs do. Quietly, persistently. When continents began to pull apart in earnest, people did not immediately think in terms of continents. They thought in terms of places becoming harder to reach. A journey that once took weeks now took months. A path that once existed year-round now vanished underwater for half the year. Visits that were once routine became rare. Rarity changes importance. What you encounter less often becomes easier to misremember. Details blur. Emphasis shifts. A story that once described a familiar place now describes a distant one. A practice that once made sense everywhere now feels specific to somewhere else. Over time, shared reference points weaken. This is how memory scatters, not because people forget deliberately, but because context dissolves. The first things to scatter are practical memories. Routes that are no longer walked fall out of use. Landmarks that are no longer seen lose descriptive precision. A bend in a river becomes a vague idea rather than a known place. A mountain pass becomes something ancestors once used, not something you yourself have crossed. As these practical memories fade, cultural ones begin to shift as well. Stories that once functioned as guidance become symbolic. A tale warning of a dangerous crossing transforms into a story about bravery or loss. The original lesson becomes secondary to the emotion it carries. This transformation is not corruption, it is adaptation. Memory reshapes itself to remain meaningful when its original context disappears. As land separation increases, groups that were once neighbours become strangers in practice, even if not in concept. They may still know of one another. They may still speak of shared origins, but lived experience no longer reinforces that connection. This changes how identity is formed. People begin to define themselves more strongly in relation to local conditions. Climate, resources, and immediate neighbours take precedence over distant ties. Language accelerates this process. Without regular contact, shared words shift in meaning. Terms once universally understood acquire local nuances. Metaphors rooted in shared geography lose clarity when geography diverges. A river metaphor means something different when one group lives near a river and another lives by a growing sea. A story about crossing land resonates differently for people who now associate distance with water. Over generations, these differences compound. Mutual intelligibility declines. Communication requires more effort. Eventually, it requires translation, even if the languages still share a common ancestry. This linguistic drift reinforces memory scattering. When words change, stories change with them. A phrase that once carried a precise meaning now evokes something broader or different. Interpretation replaces recollection. At the same time, material culture begins to diverge. Tools adapt to local environments. Boat building improves in coastal regions. Inland regions refine land-based transport and agriculture. Technologies evolve in response to immediate needs rather than shared ones. This specialization deepens separation. When people do meet, they no longer immediately recognize each other's tools or techniques. Explanation becomes necessary. Comparison replaces familiarity. Cities near emerging oceans adapt differently than those inland. Some become hubs of maritime experimentation. Others turn inward, focusing on land-based networks that still exist. Trade patterns shift accordingly. As trade slows between separating regions, goods become more locally sourced. Materials once common across vast areas become rare or unknown elsewhere. This scarcity adds symbolic value to certain items, but it also limits shared experience. Memory of earlier exchange persists, but it becomes idealized. Stories speak of a time when goods flowed more freely, when travel was easier, when connection felt natural. These stories serve as cultural anchors, even as they lose factual detail. Generational change plays a crucial role here. Children grow up knowing only the world as it is now. What feels like lost to elders feels like normality to them. They inherit stories of connection without inheriting the experience of it. This creates a gap between narrative and reality. People speak of shared origins, but daily life reinforces separation. Over time, narrative adapts to fit lived experience. Shared ancestors become mythic figures. Common origins become symbolic rather than literal. Unity becomes something that happened once, not something that defines the present. Memory scattering is not uniform. Some elements persist longer than others. Deeply embedded practices, especially those tied to fundamental human needs, remain similar across separated regions. Birth rituals, care for the sick, preparation for seasonal hardship. These practices endure because they respond to universal conditions, but their interpretations diverge. The same ritual acquires different meanings. The same practice is justified by different stories. Similar behavior masks different cultural logics. This divergence can create the illusion of complete difference, even where deep similarities remain. From the outside, cultures appear distinct. From the inside, they feel coherent and self-contained. As continents continue to drift, separation becomes undeniable. Water gaps widen beyond easy crossing. Contact becomes episodic rather than continuous. Entire generations pass without direct interaction between regions. At this point, memory scattering accelerates dramatically. Without reinforcement, shared stories fracture. Each retelling adapts more freely. Elements that no longer make sense are dropped. New elements are added to reflect local realities. A story about a great journey across land might become a story about a journey across water. A tale of migration might transform into a creation myth. Practical memory gives way to symbolic narrative. This transformation is not decay, it is cultural evolution. Stories survive by changing. They carry emotional truth even when factual alignment fades. The same process affects knowledge. Techniques that once spread widely now evolve independently. Similar problems are solved in different ways. Innovation becomes localized. Parallel development replaces shared refinement. This does not reduce ingenuity, it redirects it. Creativity flourishes within constraints. Regions develop unique strengths. Diversity increases, but the cost is fragmentation. Knowledge that could benefit others remains local. Solutions are rediscovered rather than shared. Efficiency decreases, but identity strengthens. This trade-off defines much of later human history. As memories scatter, people begin to imagine the past differently. The idea of a unified world feels implausible. Oceans feel eternal. Continents feel fixed. The notion that land was once continuous becomes difficult to grasp. When hints of this past survive, they appear as myths. Stories of ancestors who walked from faraway lands. Tales of a time when the world was closer together. These stories are often dismissed or reinterpreted, stripped of their original context. Yet fragments persist. Similar flood myths across continents. Shared symbols embedded in art. Genetic patterns reflecting ancient movement. These are the quiet residues of a connected past. From a modern perspective, we might recognize these patterns as evidence. From within the cultures that carry them, they are simply tradition. Memory scattering does not erase the past, it rearranges it. Even as continents drift farther apart, echoes of shared origin remain embedded in language structures, social practices, and cognitive patterns. They are not obvious. They require comparison to reveal. People living in separated regions may develop entirely different worldviews, but they often share underlying assumptions about causality, morality, and social organization that trace back to a time of connection. These deep structures persist because they are reinforced by human cognition itself. They were shaped during a long period of shared development and carried forward unconsciously. As oceans widen and continents settle into new positions, the scattering of memory reaches a stable state. Each region now has its own internally coherent history. Shared pasts exist only as distant myths or scholarly speculation. Yet the planet continues its slow movement. Continents drift, currents shift, climate evolves. New opportunities for contact will arise far in the future, under very different conditions. When those contacts occur, they will feel like first meetings. Cultures encountering one another across oceans will perceive difference more than similarity. Surprise replaces familiarity, but beneath that surprise lies a buried continuity, a deep time inheritance from when the Earth was whole and human culture grew without edges. When continents drifted and memories scattered, humanity did not lose its past. It redistributed it. Pieces lodged in different places, transformed by new environments and new experiences. What remains is not a single story, but many, each carrying fragments of a larger one that can only be reconstructed by stepping back far enough to see how land, movement, and time once aligned. And as the world continues to change, those fragments continue to shift, reminding us that memory, like the Earth itself, is never static. It drifts, reshapes, and settles into new forms, carrying echoes of what once was, even when the path back can no longer be walked. Long after land has separated and oceans have widened beyond walking, traces of what once existed together do not vanish. They linger, not as clear records or deliberate messages, but as echoes, subtle, uneven, and often misunderstood. When continents drifted and memories scattered, not everything scattered equally. Some things proved remarkably durable. Stone remembers pressure, genes remember movement, myth remembers feeling, and together they preserve faint outlines of a world that no longer exists. Stone is the most literal archive, but it is also the least conversational. It does not explain itself. It simply endures. In regions once connected, rock formations can tell similar stories even when separated by vast seas. Mountain chains that once formed as a single system now appear fragmented, their alignment only visible when continents are conceptually pushed back together. From the inside of any one region, these formations feel local and unique. Only with distance and comparison does their shared origin become apparent. Early civilizations would not have read stone as history. They would have read it as environment, as material to shape tools, as shelter, as obstacle. But the choices they made about stone, where they quarried, how they shaped it, which types they favoured, left patterns behind. Similar construction techniques appearing on now separated continents are not coincidences. They are habits carried across land before land pulled apart. These habits were not copied consciously as traditions to be preserved. They were simply what worked. When people use similar stone in similar ways across a connected landmass, those methods spread and stabilized. Once separation occurred, those methods persisted locally, fossilized in architecture, tools, and settlement layouts. Later observers, encountering these similarities, might be tempted to imagine direct contact across oceans or independent invention. The quieter explanation is older, that these techniques were once part of a shared practical vocabulary, developed when walking connected places now divided by water. Stone also records absence. Regions where human presence once existed may now lie beneath oceans. Coastal shelves that were once inland plains hold submerged river valleys, buried shorelines, drowned settlements. These are not myths. They are geological facts. The sea did not erase these places, it covered them. What remains above water are fragments, foundations without context. Ruins repurposed by later cultures who had no memory of who built them first. Stone outlasts story, but it cannot explain itself without interpretation. Genes, unlike stone, are living archives. They move with people. They change slowly. They carry history not as narrative but as probability. When populations once connected become isolated, genetic similarities persist far longer than cultural ones. In modern times, genetic studies reveal unexpected connections between populations separated by oceans, patterns that suggest ancient movement, deep shared ancestry, long periods of gene flow that predate known migrations. These findings are often surprising because they challenge simpler stories of human dispersal. On a connected Earth, gene flow would have been continuous, people moving, intermarrying, sharing space across vast distances. Genetic diversity would spread gradually rather than clumping sharply. Separation interrupts this flow, but it does not erase its legacy. Even tens of thousands of years later, these shared genetic markers remain detectable. They are diluted, recombined, reshaped by later migrations, but they persist. They whisper of a time when populations were not bounded by oceans, when movement was constrained only by endurance. Genes also preserve adaptation. Traits shaped by ancient climates, diets, and disease environments persist even when environments change. A population living near a coast today may carry genetic traits adapted to inland conditions long gone. These traits do not vanish immediately. They linger, sometimes puzzling modern researchers. This mismatch between genes and environment can create narratives of mystery. Why do people in one region share traits with those far away? Why do certain adaptations appear where they seem unnecessary? The answer lies not in recent history but in deep continuity. Myth is different. It does not preserve facts reliably, but it preserves meaning with remarkable tenacity. Myths survive because they adapt. They shed details that no longer fit and absorb new ones that resonate. Yet certain structures persist, especially those tied to shared early experiences. Across continents, separated by oceans, similar myths appear. Flood stories, tales of ancestors arriving from elsewhere, stories of a time when the world was closer together, when travel was easier, when humans and the land were more intimately connected. These are often dismissed as universal psychological patterns or coincidence. But universality does not arise from nothing. Shared experience leaves shared imprints. When large populations experience similar environmental transitions, those transitions shape narrative memory. The flooding of lowlands as seas rose would have been one of the most profound changes early civilizations experienced. Even if it unfolded over generations, its emotional impact would be significant. Loss of familiar land, retreat from places ancestors lived, transformation of known routes into water. Such experiences would not be recorded as geological events. They would be remembered as stories. Stories of deluge, of land disappearing, of survival through movement. Over time, these stories would shift from historical memory to mythic explanation. Each region would adapt the story to local conditions. One emphasizes rain, another emphasizes rising water, another emphasizes divine displeasure or cosmic cycles. But the emotional core remains. A world changed, familiar ground lost, life continuing elsewhere. Similarly, myths of common ancestry appear across cultures. Stories of people emerging from the earth, descending from a single source spreading outward. These narratives may not describe literal events, but they reflect an intuitive understanding of shared origin. When people once lived in continuous contact, the idea of shared ancestry would feel obvious. After separation, it becomes abstract. Myth preserves it where direct memory cannot. Language itself carries mythic echoes. Certain narrative structures recur across distant cultures. The trickster, the flood survivor, the wandering ancestor. These figures may not be the same character, but they play similar roles. They encode lessons relevant to mobile, adaptive societies shaped by environmental change. Stone, genes, and myth operate on different timescales, but they overlap. Stone preserves the physical traces of movement and construction. Genes preserve the biological traces of connection. Myth preserves the emotional and cognitive traces of shared experience. Individually, each is ambiguous. Together they form a pattern that suggests something larger than coincidence. When continents drifted apart, no one set out to preserve a record of unity. There was no archive to protect. What survived did so accidentally, embedded in things that continue because they serve other purposes. Stone persists because it is durable. Genes persist because they reproduce. Myth persists because it helps people make sense of their world. This makes these echoes uneven. Some regions preserve more stone evidence. Others preserve stronger genetic signals. Others retain rich mythic traditions. None alone tell the full story. Later civilizations encountering these echoes interpret them through their own frameworks. A ruin becomes evidence of a lost advanced society. A genetic similarity becomes proof of recent contact. A myth becomes symbolic allegory divorced from any historical grounding. These interpretations say more about the interpreter than the origin. The idea that early civilization could have existed on a unified Earth challenges many assumptions. It challenges linear progress narratives. It complicates simple models of migration. It blurs the boundary between prehistory and history. As a result, evidence supporting such a possibility is often dismissed or compartmentalized. Geological evidence is treated separately from genetic evidence. Myth is treated as purely symbolic. Connections are avoided rather than explored. Yet when viewed slowly, patiently, without urgency to conclude, the echoes align. Stone shows us that land once fit together. Genes show us that people once moved freely across that land. Myth shows us that people remembered living in a world that later changed dramatically. None of this proves the existence of a specific lost civilization. It does not need to. The idea explored here is not about monuments or empires. It is about continuity, about the conditions under which shared culture could grow before separation imposed difference. A civilization in this sense does not require writing, metallurgy, or cities as we imagine them. It requires sustained interaction, shared knowledge, and adaptive continuity across generations. Those conditions were present on a whole Earth. When separation came, civilization did not vanish. It diversified, it fractured, it localized. What had once been shared became regional. What had once been familiar became foreign. The echoes remain because they were laid down during a long period of connection. They persist because nothing fully replaces them. Modern science occasionally stumbles upon these echoes unexpectedly. A genetic marker appears where it should not. A myth resembles another too closely to ignore. A geological formation aligns across oceans with uncanny precision. Each time, there is a temptation to treat the finding as isolated, to explain it away, to avoid larger implications. But taken together, they invite a quieter question. Not, did a lost civilization exist in the dramatic sense? But how deeply did connection shape early humanity before separation reshaped it? Echoes do not demand belief. They invite attention. They suggest that the world we inherit is not just the product of recent history, but of deep time processes that shaped how humans learn to live together, communicate, adapt, and remember. As continents continue to drift even now, And as modern civilization experiences new forms of connection and separation, these echoes gain relevance. They remind us that unity and fragmentation are not permanent states. They are phases. Stone will outlast us. Genes will continue to change. Myths will adapt again. The echoes of our own time will scatter into the future to be interpreted by those who come later, perhaps misunderstanding us in the same ways we misunderstand the past. And somewhere beneath that long process, the memory of a whole Earth remains faint but persistent, carried not as a clear story, but as a resonance, detectable only when we listen across disciplines, across distances, and across time itself. As the day loosens its hold and the world around you begins to quiet, it can be comforting to let your thoughts drift somewhere far from schedules and sharp edges, somewhere slower, somewhere older, a place that does not ask anything of you except attention, and even that gently fades as rest approaches. Tonight, that place is a world that once was one. Imagine lying down on the ground of that ancient earth. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. The land beneath you is continuous in every direction, stretching farther than anyone alive could ever walk in a lifetime. There are no borders pressed into the soil, no lines drawn across hills or plains, just ground, textured and solid, holding warmth from the day and slowly releasing it into the cooling air. Above you, the sky looks much as it always has. Stars emerge one by one, not competing with artificial light, not dimmed by haze. They feel close, not because they are nearer, but because nothing distracts from them. The same stars are visible to people lying down hundreds, even thousands of kilometers away, all across this unified land. Different angles, different horizons, but the same sky. Breathe and feel slower here, not because anything is forcing it to be, but because there is no reason to hurry. The night does not signal unfinished work, it signals rest. Sleep comes when it comes, guided by fatigue rather than obligation. In this world, the idea of falling asleep carries no tension. There is no anxiety about tomorrow's demands. Tomorrow will come when the light returns, and whatever it brings will be handled then. For now, the only task is to let the body settle. People living on this earth would fall asleep with the land in mind, not as an object, but as an environment they are part of. The sounds around them are familiar. Insects, wind moving through vegetation, the distant calls of animals that share the night. None of these sounds are alarming. They are signals that the world is behaving normally. Even danger, when it exists, does not dominate thought. It is managed through habit. Camps are placed where they make sense. Fires are maintained. People sleep in groups or alone depending on conditions. Sleep is not careless, but it is not fearful. As eyes close, memory drifts in gently. Not memory as a sequence of events, but memory as texture. The feel of walking long distances. The satisfaction of reaching a place that offers water and shelter. The quiet pleasure of shared meals and shared stories. There is no sense of being small in a threatening way. The world is vast, yes, but it is familiar in its vastness. It has been walked, learned, adapted to. It does not feel hostile. It feels indifferent in a way that allows life to find its place. Falling asleep on a world that once was one means resting with the assumption of connection. Even if you cannot see anyone else, you know others exist beyond the horizon, not as abstractions, but as people living similar lives under the same sky. That knowledge does not require proof. It is simply part of how the world works. Thoughts wander without urgency, perhaps to the idea of journeys that take weeks, not because of distance alone, but because stopping is part of the process. You walk until it makes sense to stop. You sleep where it makes sense to sleep. The next day unfolds from there. There is comfort in that simplicity. No need to optimize, no need to compress time. Life stretches to fit the land rather than the other way around. As sleep deepens, awareness of the Earth's slow movement does not intrude. No one senses tectonic plates shifting beneath them. No one hears continents beginning their long separation. These processes move too slowly to matter to a resting body. And yet, those movements are happening, quietly, imperceptibly. The ground beneath you is not fixed in the cosmic sense. It is participating in cycles far larger than any human concern. But for now, those cycles do not disrupt rest. They simply exist. This is one of the most gentle truths of that ancient world. Change does not always announce itself. Most of it happens beneath awareness, allowing life to continue uninterrupted until adaptation becomes necessary. Sleep, in this context, is not escape. It is participation. The body aligns itself with the rhythms of the planet. Heart rate slows, muscles release tension, breathing finds a steady pattern. There is no artificial separation between night and day beyond light and dark. No internal clock fighting external conditions. When the body needs rest, it rests. Dreams come softly. They are not overloaded with imagery or anxiety. They are shaped by lived experience, walking, gathering, sharing, familiar places blending into one another without sharp transitions. Dreams might carry images of long paths, not because of longing, but because movement is normal. They might carry faces of people met briefly and then again much later, because connection does not require permanence to matter. In these dreams, the land does not fragment. Rivers flow continuously. Mountains stretch on. There is no sense of falling off the edge of the world or being cut off from elsewhere. Even unfamiliar places feel reachable, given time. As sleep deepens further, even dreams loosen their grip. Conscious thought fades. The body rests fully, supported by ground that feels solid and dependable. In this state, the idea of civilization does not exist. There is no self-awareness about being part of something called culture or history. There is simply life, unfolding day by day. This is important. The people of this world would not fall asleep thinking of themselves as participants in an early civilization on a unified Earth. They would fall asleep thinking of what happened that day, if they thought of anything at all. Hunger satisfied, work done, movement paused. Meaning is not imposed. It emerges quietly, over time, through repetition. As continents slowly drift and the world eventually changes beyond recognition, this simplicity will become harder to maintain. Separation will introduce new anxieties. Distance will require planning. Water will impose boundaries that walking cannot cross. Sleep too will change. People living near coasts will learn to listen for tides. Those crossing water will carry different fears. Those isolated by distance will sleep with less certainty about connection. But here, in this moment, none of that has happened yet. The world is still one. The land still stretches uninterrupted. The sky still feels shared. Knowledge still flows with movement. Stories still travel easily. Memory still feels communal. Falling asleep in such a world carries a sense of belonging that does not depend on identity or ideology. You belong because you exist within a system that accommodates you. The land does not need to recognize you. It simply supports you. As the night deepens, sounds soften. Even the insects quiet down. Temperature stabilizes. The body adjusts automatically, pulling warmth inward, settling into stillness. There is no rush toward morning. Morning will come whether you anticipate it or not. For now, the present is enough. This is perhaps the most profound difference between that ancient world and the one we know now. Rest is not something squeezed between obligations. It is an integrated part of life's rhythm. As you imagine this, there is no need to hold on to details. Let them blur. Let the image soften. The purpose here is not to remember, but to rest. If thoughts arise about continents drifting, about memory scattering, about echoes left behind, they can drift too. They do not need resolution. They are part of a much larger process that does not require your attention right now. The Earth will continue to move whether you think about it or not. History will continue to unfold whether it is recorded or forgotten. None of that interferes with sleep, so allow yourself to settle into this idea of a world that once was one, not as a concept to analyse, but as a backdrop for rest. A steady ground, a shared sky, a quiet night. Breathing slows further, muscles let go. Awareness narrows to simple sensations, weight supported, air moving in and out. There is nothing to solve, nothing to prepare for, nothing to remember perfectly. Just the feeling of being part of something vast, stable on the scale that matters most right now, and patient enough to carry you into rest. And as sleep deepens, the image of that unified world does not end. It does not need to. It simply fades from focus, the way land fades into darkness at night, still there, still whole, even when you're no longer watching.